Hey everyone! Welcome back or welcome for the first time. Find a comfortable spot, dim those lights if you haven't already, and settle in. Tonight we're drifting back, way back, to a world without central heating, without electric blankets, without the comforting, silent hum of a furnace kicking on in the middle of the night. We're going to the heart of the ancient world, to the Romans, and we're going to ask a very simple, very chilly question. How did they get through the winter? Now, your mind might immediately jump to images of toga-clad senators shivering in marble halls or legions freezing on some windswept dramatic frontier. And for a lot of people, that image would be pretty accurate. But for a very select, very fortunate few, winter was a different story. A story of engineering, luxury, and a clear, warm line drawn between the haves and the have-nots. So let's start not with the cold, but with the almost unimaginable warmth. We begin, as many Roman luxuries do, with a bath. Not a quick rinse, but the vast, sprawling social epicenters known as thermae. These were places of business, gossip, and relaxation, and they required an immense amount of heat for the hot rooms, the warm rooms, and the pools. The solution, developed around the 1st century BC, was an engineering marvel called the Hypocaust. The principle was beautifully simple, if exhausting to build and maintain. The floor of a room would be raised several feet off the ground by a forest of small stacked brick pillars. In an adjoining furnace room, a fire would be constantly stoked. The hot air and smoke from this fire would then be channeled into that hollow space beneath the floor, gently cooking the tiles above from underneath. You'd walk barefoot on a mosaic warmed from below, which must have felt divine. But they didn't stop at the floor. In the most opulent setups, they embedded special box-shaped tiles in the walls. These hollow tiles acted like chimneys, allowing the hot air to rise through the walls as well, creating a kind of primitive but effective central heating system. Imagine that! In the dead of an Italian winter, with a chilly drizzle falling outside, a wealthy Roman could be lounging in a room heated from the floor and the walls. The sophistication of this, in an ancient context, is genuinely staggering. Archaeologists find the remains of these systems, the grids of brick pillars, the soot stains in the wall cavities, from the heart of Italy to the far-flung provinces of Britain, a uniform symbol of Roman comfort imposed on a diverse empire. And that's the crucial word here, symbol. Because the Hypocaust was never, ever about mere survival or basic comfort. It was a roaring, fuel-guzzling billboard of wealth and status. This was a luxury so profound, it was almost its own language. Think about the cost. You needed skilled engineers and builders to design and construct it, not just any bricklayer. You needed a constant supply of wood, which, in an empire busy building ships and houses, was a significant and expensive commodity. And most of all, you needed labor. Someone, almost certainly an enslaved person, had to spend hours each day feeding that furnace, clearing the ash, and ensuring the flues didn't get blocked. The warmth you felt was directly powered by someone else's toil in a smoky, hot room. This is where the Roman winter truly splits into two parallel experiences. For the elite, winter was something to be elegantly negated within the walls of your villa. A visitor stepping from the crisp air into your home would be greeted not by a damp chill, but by the gentle, radiant heat rising from the floor. The message was instantaneous and unmistakable. You are in the home of someone powerful. They could host dinner parties in heated dining rooms, take warmed baths in their private suites, and essentially pretend winter wasn't happening. They had created a bubble of perpetual engineered spring. So, what about everyone else? The vast, vast majority of Romans, the shopkeepers, the soldiers, the farmers, the laborers living in cramped insulae apartment blocks, they didn't have hypocausts. The idea would be laughable. For them, winter was a tangible, pressing reality to be managed, not erased. Their strategies were less about spectacular engineering and more about intelligent adaptation, clever use of materials, and a deep, ingrained understanding of their environment. The Hypocaust is the glittering hot exception. The rest of Rome's winter was about the rule, practicality. Let's float away from those warm villas for a moment and into the heart of a more typical Roman home, the kitchen. Even without underfloor heating, this was the thermal heart of the common house. The focus, the hearth, was where the real warmth was generated. It was an open stove, burning charcoal or wood, used for every meal. This is where families would congregate, drawn by the necessity of cooking and the bonus of heat. The design showed a pragmatic understanding of climate control. Kitchens were usually placed at the back of the house, often near a courtyard or garden, with a window above the hearth to vent smoke. It was a simple system. The heat you cooked with was the heat you lived with. The worktops were durable stone or wood, easy to clean, and shelves climbed the walls for vertical storage of pots, ingredients, and utensils. It was a functional, multi-purpose space where the battle against the cold was fought one meal and one fire at a time. But surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm in the moment. It was about the long, lean months when fresh food was a memory. This is where Roman ingenuity shifted from heating to preserving. Long before the first frost, the work of securing the winter larder began, and they were masters of it. Their most essential technique was salting. Fish and pork in particular were packed in mountains of salt to draw out moisture and halt spoilage. This wasn't gourmet cuisine, this was calorie insurance, crucial for the army on campaign and families at home. Sometimes they'd add another layer of protection and flavor by smoking the salted meats. They also looked to nature's own preservatives. Olive oil, that staple of the Mediterranean triad, wasn't just for cooking and lighting lamps. It could be used to seal foods in airtight containers, locking out the air that caused decay. Honey, prized for its natural antibacterial properties, was a sweet solution for preserving fruits and even some meats. And then there was drying. Grapes became raisins, figs shriveled into long-lasting sweetness, all under the relentless summer sun. These dried, salted, and oil-packed foods were the quiet, durable heroes of the Roman winter, stored in the heart of the home. And for storage, they had a champion container, the dolia. These were massive, bulbous earthenware jars, often so huge they were partially buried in the ground for stability. They were the ancient equivalent of the pantry cupboard and the refrigerator combined. Buried in the earth, their contents were protected from temperature swings. A dolium could hold grain, dried legumes, salted goods, or even wine and olive oil. In a cool, dark corner of a cellar or a specially designed storage room, these jars created a stable microclimate. The thick ceramic walls insulated their contents, keeping them cooler in the residual heat of autumn and buffering them against the deep chill of winter. It was passive, brilliant climate control, accessible to far more people than a hypocaust ever was. This was the daily reality. While the senator's slaves stoked the furnace to keep the library at a perfect temperature, a baker's family in the Subura would be huddled around their kitchen hearth, the warmth from the bread oven a welcome bonus. The senator might snack on honey-preserved exotic fruits imported from the east. The baker's family would rely on their own stores of dried figs and barley from their dolia. Two worlds, one city, separated by a gulf of wealth, but connected by the same season. The Roman winter was not a single experience, it was a spectrum, from the artfully ignored chill of the hyper-wealthy to the intimately managed cold of the common citizen. And as we'll see, this divide, this reliance on natural systems and seasonal rhythms would become deeply relevant as the empire itself aged and the climate, as it always does, began to change. But for now, let's just sit with that image, the silent, buried dolia, those ceramic guardians of the winter larder. They represent a kind of static, patient warmth, the preservation of summer's energy for the barren months. But life, especially Roman life, couldn't be lived entirely in the kitchen or around the storage jar. People had to move. They had to go to the forum, to the baths, to work. And outside the heated bubble of a wealthy villa or the focused hearth of a kitchen, the air was cold. This is where Roman winter survival becomes personal, portable, and woven directly into what they wore and carried. Let's talk about the Roman wardrobe, because it was a layered defense system. The famous toga, that symbol of Roman civic identity, was a summer garment. No sensible person wore a toga in a Roman winter if they could avoid it. When the temperature dropped, practicality took over. The base layer for many men was the tunica, a simple woolen shirt that could be worn sleeveless or with sleeves. For winter, you'd want the sleeves, and you might wear two of them. Over this, for added warmth and a bit more dignity, went the pannula. This was a heavy woolen cloak, usually hooded, fastened at the front. It was essentially an all-weather poncho, and it came in various weights and qualities. A soldier on the German frontier would have a thick, coarse, and probably damp version. A merchant in Rome might have a finer, dyed one. It was universal, democratic winter wear. For the elite, who still had to project status even while bundled up, there was the lacerna, or the more formal pallium. These were heavier, often richly colored and bordered cloaks made from finer wool or even silk for the absurdly wealthy. They were fastened with elaborate brooches. So, while a common laborer wrapped himself in a dun-colored pannula just to stop shivering, a senator's cloak was a billboard of his rank, declaring that even his protection from the elements was superior. The principle, however, was the same. Trap a layer of warm air next to the body with wool. It's a technology we still use today, just with more synthetic fibers. Now, wool was the undisputed champion fabric. It's water-resistant, insulating even when wet, and readily available. But the Romans also used leather and fur. Leather perons or boots were essential for keeping feet dry and somewhat warm. Fur linings from animals like rabbit or wolf would have been used by those who could afford it, or those on the frontiers who needed it most. There's a certain irony in a Roman legionary, the symbol of Mediterranean order, standing watch on Hadrian's wall rampart, bundled in furs, looking for all the world like the barbarians he was stationed there to keep out. Necessity has a way of blurring cultural lines. But clothing can only do so much. Your hands, holding the reins of a chariot or counting coins in the market, would get cold. Your feet, on a stone floor, would grow numb. This is where we see the Romans get clever with small personal technology. One of the most charming artifacts to survive from the period is the hand warmer. These were often small, perforated bronze boxes, beautifully made. You would fill them with hot charcoal or smoldering ashes from the hearth, close the lid, and carry them in your hand or tucked into your cloak. They were personal, radiant heat sources. A government clerk writing in an unheated basilica could have one sitting on his desk, his fingers occasionally hovering over the warm metal grill. A lady in her litter might have one tucked under a blanket. It was a tiny, mobile piece of the hearth. For the feet, they had the scarabatia, a kind of foot stove. This was a larger, often ceramic or metal pan, again filled with hot coals or ashes. You would place your feet on it or near it, usually under a table or desk, hidden by your long tunic or cloak. It was less portable but perfect for stationary activities, weaving, studying, or the long hours of a formal dinner. Imagine a Roman schoolroom, the student's breath visible in the air, but a gentle heat rising from a few of these stoves under the benches. It wasn't central heating, but it was a targeted, efficient relief. And speaking of dinner, this brings us to another key Roman strategy for internal warmth: diet and drink. The Roman winter diet shifted. It became heavier, more calorie-dense. Stews and porridges, which could simmer for hours on the hearth using preserved meats and dried vegetables, became staples. They were hot, filling, and used fuel efficiently. But the real social lubricant and internal heater was wine. Roman wine was not sipped like a modern Pinot Noir. It was almost always mixed with water, and in winter it was often served calidum, warmed. They would heat it with a hot poker plunged directly into the cup or warm it in a vessel over a fire. Sometimes they would add spices like pepper, saffron, or honey, creating a primitive form of mulled wine. This practice, called conditum, was especially popular. A cup of hot, spiced wine did more than just intoxicate. It spread a visceral warmth from the inside out. It was medicine, social ritual, and heating system all in one. Taverns in winter would have been hazy, warm spaces, not just from a brazier, but from the steam of many cups of kalidum. For the price of a drink, you could buy an hour of deep, radiating comfort. This focus on drinkable warmth highlights a crucial, often overlooked aspect of surviving ancient winters: the psychological. The darkness came early. The days were short, gray, and damp. Seasonal depression, or just profound boredom and isolation, was a real threat. The Roman calendar was in part a clever tool to combat this. The festival of Saturnalia, held in mid-December, was a deliberate explosion of light and role reversal in the darkest time of the year. Masters served slaves, candles were lit, gifts were exchanged, and social norms were temporarily suspended. It was a societal pressure valve, a way to collectively shrug off the gloom. Later, the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, on December 25th, marked the turning point after the solstice, the promise of returning light. These weren't just religious observances, they were essential mental health infrastructure, ways to mark time and maintain morale when nature seemed most bleak and still. So the picture becomes more complete. A Roman citizen facing a winter day would layer his woolens, perhaps tuck a bronze hand warmer into his belt, and head out. His meals would be hot, stew-based affairs. His drinks would be warmed. His evenings might be spent near a brazier, his feet on a scarabatia, listening to the rain. And his calendar would give him points of light to look forward to, festivals that promised community and the eventual return of the sun. It was a holistic approach, engaging fabric, food, technology, and tradition in a concerted campaign against the cold. Yet for all this personal adaptation, the most profound relationship with winter was shaped by the very structure of the Roman world: architecture. And not just the Hypocaust, but the fundamental design of the Roman house and city. They understood sun and shadow in a way we, with our electric lights and universal heating, have largely forgotten. The ideal Roman domus was built around an atrium and a peristyle garden, but its main living rooms, the tablinum and triclinium, were deliberately placed to capture the low, weak sun of the winter months. Large south-facing openings, often covered with translucent sheets of selenite or mica, would let in light and some passive solar heat. In summer, these rooms could be shaded. In winter, they became sun traps. Even the bustling city was designed with climate in mind. The narrow, canyon-like streets of a typical Roman district, the insula, were not just a result of haphazard planning. Their narrowness provided shade and coolness in summer, but also broke the force of winter winds. The uniform height of many apartment blocks created a wind-breaking effect. Public spaces, like the Forum, were often paved with dark stone, which would absorb solar heat during the day and radiate it back slightly, taking the edge off the evening chill. The Romans were masters of passive environmental design, using geometry, orientation, and materials to create microclimates. Your personal hand warmer was a tactical solution. The orientation of your house was the strategic one. This leads us to the final and perhaps most dramatic frontier of the Roman winter, the military. Because while a civilian in Rome could adapt and lair and drink hot wine, a soldier on the Rhine or in Britannia faced a meteorological enemy as formidable as any tribal warrior. How the legionary camp became a machine for winter survival is a story of discipline, standardization, and desperate ingenuity. A story we'll turn to next as we leave the relatively mild winter of the Mediterranean for the hard frost of the provinces. We left off with the image of a Roman in the capital, strategically layered in wool, sipping warm wine and oriented toward the winter sun. It was a life of managed chill, of clever adaptations within the relative security of the Mediterranean heartland. But the Roman Empire was not built in Italy alone. Its power stretched into climates that viewed a typical Roman winter as a pleasant autumn. For the legionaries stationed on the fog-draped border of Britannia, the rain-swept hills of Germania, or the frozen Danube frontier, Winter was not an inconvenience to be designed around. It was an existential siege, a season that could kill an army as surely as any enemy ambush. This is where the Roman genius for standardization, discipline, and infrastructure met its greatest environmental test. The first and most formidable line of defense was not a cloak or a fire, but a shovel. When the autumn campaign ceased and the skies threatened, the legions did not retreat to distant cities. They stopped and they built. They constructed the Castra Hiberna, the winter camp. This was not the temporary marching camp of summer, a simple earthen rampart dug each night. This was a permanent fortress town, built to last for months. The process was a relentless, well-practiced ballet of labor. Thousands of men would clear land, fell trees, dig defensive ditches, and raise tall, timber-reinforced earthen walls. Inside, a rigid grid of gravel streets was laid out. Then came the barracks. These were not tents, but long, sturdy buildings with timber frames, wattle and daub walls, and roofs of thatch or wooden shingles. The centurion got a private room at the end. The common legionaries shared a cramped space, sleeping on bunk beds with mattresses stuffed with straw. A central, elongated hearth ran down the length of the building. This was the sole source of heat. The air inside would have been thick with wood smoke, damp wool, and the smell of men in close quarters, a pungent but life-saving fug. The camp was a machine for survival. It contained granaries to protect the season's grain supply, workshops for repairing gear, a hospital, and a commander's headquarters. Most crucially, it had immense storehouses for fuel. A legion of 5,000 men, each needing heat for cooking and a sliver of warmth, would consume forests. The stockpiling of firewood and charcoal was a logistical operation as critical as stockpiling grain or weapons. The surrounding landscape for miles would be systematically denuded, a stark reminder of the environmental footprint of keeping Rome's frontier warm. Now picture the daily reality for a legionary from, say, sunny Syria posted to the frontier of Britannia. The winter day was brutally short, a few hours of weak gray light. Dawn muster would be conducted in a freezing mist, men's breath pluming in the air. Training continued, of course, drills with weighted weapons, marching within the camp walls to maintain discipline and, frankly, to generate body heat. But much of the day was dedicated to the endless, dreary work of maintenance, repairing armor that rusted in the damp, treating leather that grew stiff, cleaning mud from everything, and always the duty roster included parties sent out, under guard, to cut more wood. It was monotonous, cold, and backbreaking. For warmth, the soldier had his issued gear. The famous lorica segmentata plate armor was reserved for battle. In camp, he'd wear a simple mail shirt or just his winter tunics. Over these, he had the sagum, a heavy rectangular military cloak made of coarse, thick wool, fastened with a simple clasp. It was his blanket, his raincoat, and his sleeping cover. On his feet were the caligae, heavy-soled sandals. The open design, so good for preventing trench foot in summer, was a liability in cold mud and snow. There's evidence that in northern postings, soldiers sometimes adopted the enclosed boots of the local populations, another practical blurring of the line between Roman and barbarian. His personal comfort came from his contubernium, his 8-man mess group. These men shared a barracks room, cooked together over their shared hearth, and were mutually responsible for each other. The social and thermal unit was the same. They would huddle around their fire, eating a hot stew of pulse, a barley porridge, flavored with salted meat or a little garum, drinking sour army-issue wine, often warmed. The gossip, the complaints, the shared misery, this was as vital to morale as the calories. The army tried to stave off the deepest psychological gloom with routine, with paydays, and with religious festivals adapted to the military calendar. A midwinter celebration in a frontier fort with extra rations of wine and perhaps a sacrifice to Mithras or Jupiter Dolicanus would be a bright, vital spark in the long darkness.
But for all this organization,
winter was still the great enemy. Sickness rampaged through the close quarters. Pneumonia, rheumatic fevers, and rampant dysentery could cripple a legion without a single enemy arrow being fired. The tombstone of a soldier often didn't say "killed in battle," but simply "hic situs est," he lies here, a victim of the climate. Desertion rates always spiked in spring after men had endured a long winter's contemplation of their frozen posting. The civilian populations in these provinces, the communities growing up around the forts, faced the winter with a different toolkit, one born of deep generational knowledge. They lived in houses the Romans would have found primitive, round houses with conical thatched roofs like those of the Celtic Britons. And these structures were, in their own way, brilliantly adapted. The central hearth's smoke rose slowly through the thick thatch, which acted as a superb insulator, curing the straw and repelling water. The single low doorway broke the wind, and the massive thermal mass of the earth floor and lower walls retained gentle heat. A Roman barracks was a drafty, smoky longhouse. A native roundhouse was a sealed, efficient thermal capsule. Over centuries, the two styles would influence each other, with Romano-British villas incorporating local hypocausts and more insulated designs. This provincial winter experience of the legionary in his standardized fort and the native in their ancestral home shows the two faces of the empire. One was imposed, a blanket of military order laid over the land, consuming resources with relentless efficiency. The other was organic, shaped by the land itself. Both were strategies for resilience. And as the empire aged, the strategies began to falter. The stable, relatively warm climate of the early imperial period, known as the Roman climatic optimum, gradually shifted. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the climate was becoming more volatile, cooler, and wetter. This wasn't an ice age, but a late antique little ice age that made the delicate systems of survival more precarious. Harvests failed more often in marginal provinces. The cost of transporting grain from Egypt or Africa soared. The fuel demands of cities and armies grew harder to meet as local woodlands were exhausted. The very infrastructure of warmth, the hypocausts, the bathhouses, became astronomically expensive to maintain. There's a poignant symbolism in the great bath complexes of northern Britain, like those at Hadrian's Wall, which were systematically dismantled in the 4th century. The legionaries themselves tore down the hypocaust piles and piping to reuse the lead for other purposes. The deliberate, engineered warmth of Rome was being cannibalized, piece by piece, a quiet surrender to a growing chill that was both literal and metaphorical. The story of the Roman winter, then, ends not with a solution, but with an attenuation. The grand, fuel-hungry technologies of the elite proved fragile in the long run. What endured were the simpler, resilient practices, the wool cloak, the stored grain in the dolium, the stew over the hearth, the community huddled against the dark. These were technologies not of empire, but of home. And as the centralized power of Rome receded, it was these intimate, personal defenses against the cold that people fell back on in a world that was growing once again, locally cold, locally dark, and locally managed. The winter that Rome had once held at bay with engineering and organization was seeping back in, and the long, slow process of finding warmth would begin anew. We've followed the warmth from the Hypocaust's luxury to the legionary's lonely fire, watching as the strategies for survival splinter across the vast mosaic of the empire. We've seen how winter was engineered, layered against, and endured. But there is one final realm to explore, less tangible than a brick floor or a wool cloak, yet just as critical. This is the winter of the mind and the spirit, the cultural and psychological world that the cold months shaped, and the haunting legacy that remained when the fires finally went out.
For Roman society, winter imposed a different rhythm, a kind of forced introspection and social intensification. The seas became treacherous, closing the vital trade routes that fed the capital. The great cursus publicus, the imperial courier network, slowed to a crawl as roads turned to mud and mountain passes filled with snow. The empire, that sprawling organism of communication and control, experienced a seasonal neuropathy. News from the provinces grew stale. Governors made decisions without immediate oversight. In a very real sense, the empire shrank and became more localized each winter. This physical isolation turned social life inward. For the elite, the long evenings in the heated triclinium were not just about comfort, but about cementing alliances. The winter dinner party became a crucial political arena. With fewer distractions, conversation was the main event. They would recline for hours, not just eating and drinking, but engaging in philosophical debates, reciting poetry, or listening to enslaved musicians. The Greek writer Plutarch, observing Romans, even posed a question for such occasions: whether the Athenians were more renowned in war or in wisdom. This was the season for intellectual games, for gossip, for the careful work of patronage and persuasion that could not be done in the bustling forum. Winter was when the social fabric was darned and reinforced in private over cups of warm wine. For the common people, the inward turn was more about sheer survival. With fewer daylight hours for labor and with many forms of outdoor work suspended, life contracted to the domestic sphere. This was the time for indoor crafts, repairing tools, weaving cloth, making or mending pottery. The storytelling tradition would have flourished, with myths and family histories recited by the hearthlight. It was also, inevitably, a time of increased tension. Crowded together in small, poorly ventilated spaces with dwindling supplies and the constant anxiety of whether the stores would last until spring, tempers would fray. The Roman concept of domus, the household as a sacred, ordered space, was under its greatest seasonal stress. The paterfamilias's authority was tested not by external threats, but by the simmering pressure of cold and scarcity within his own walls. This psychological weight found expression in their very understanding of the season. In the Roman worldview, winter was not a neutral period. It was a time governed by older, darker forces. The Saturnalia, with its role reversals and carnivalesque chaos, was a ritualized coping mechanism, a way to let off steam and acknowledge the world turned upside down by the sun's absence. The deities associated with this time were chthonic, linked to the underworld and the dead. The Parentalia in February was a festival to honor one's ancestors, a time when the veil between the living and the dead was thought to be thin. The cold, barren earth was a mirror of the realm of Dis-Pater. Winter was thus a season with a distinct spiritual character, somber, reflective, and shadowed by mortality. And for the philosophers, particularly the Stoics, who were so popular among the Roman elite, winter was the ultimate metaphor and teacher. Seneca, in his letters, often used cold, hardship, and seasonal change as exercises in perspective. To complain about the cold was to complain about the nature of the universe, a futile and ignoble act. True virtue lay in accepting the frost, the short days, and the need for a thicker cloak with the same calm indifference as one accepted a change in political fortune. A good man is happy even in winter, he suggested. The season was a built-in annual training regimen for resilience and self-control. The physical act of enduring the cold was a rehearsal for enduring life's other, greater hardships. Yet, as we've seen with the cannibalized bathhouses on the frontier, this philosophical resilience and these intricate social adaptations eventually met a force they could not outlast: long-term climatic change and systemic decay. The slow cooling of the late antique period was more than an inconvenience. It was a persistent, low-grade stressor on an already strained system. As the empire fragmented, the grand, interconnected solutions became impossible. The grain dole in Rome became erratic, then ceased. The Annona Militaris, the system supplying the armies, broke down. A legion could no longer order warm cloaks from a centralized imperial warehouse. It had to scavenge locally. In this dwindling world, the winter experience reverted to its most primal, pre-imperial form. the knowledge of how to thatch a roof tightly, where to find the best peat for fuel, how to preserve food without imperial salt markets. This local folk knowledge became paramount. The villa owner who could no longer afford to fire his Hypocaust closed off most of his house, retreating with his family to the single room with the best hearth, much like a Celtic chieftain in his roundhouse. The universal symbols of Roman winter, the standardized military sagum, the imported Egyptian grain, gave way to a patchwork of regional adaptations.
The final haunting legacy of the Roman winter is written in the landscape and in the bones. Paleoclimatologists studying ice cores and tree rings can trace the periods of exceptional cold and volatility. Archaeologists find the material testimony, the layers in a frontier fort's rubbish pits showing a shift from a diverse Mediterranean diet to one dominated by hardy local grains and hunted game. They find the skeletons, where analysis of isotopes and bone lesions can tell stories of childhood nutritional stress, of periods of famine, of bodies that bore the lifelong mark of a particularly harsh season long before death. The story of how the Romans survived winter, then, is not a story of a single triumph. It is a story of a spectrum of responses, from the breathtaking arrogance of the Hypocaust to the desperate huddle of the soldier. It reveals the core tensions of Roman civilization itself, between luxury and necessity, between centralized order and local knowledge, between the human will to master nature and nature's patient, inevitable reclamation. Their warmth was always provisional, purchased with labor, logistics, and luck. In the end, the winter outlasted them. The snow fell on the silent, buried Hypocausts of abandoned villas. The frost cracked the stones of the Via Appia. The wind blew through the empty barracks of Hadrian's Wall, where the only remaining warmth was the memory of 1,000 small, lonely fires. The Romans, for all their engineering and empire, never conquered the cold. They merely negotiated with it, season after season, in a long, quiet, and ultimately fragile truce. And when their power receded, the terms of that truce simply became, once again, personal, local, and profoundly, enduringly human. We've come to the quiet, lingering end of our journey, past the warm floors, past the woolen cloaks and the hissing hand warmers, past the legions shivering in their timber halls. We've seen the strategies, from the magnificent to the mundane. Now we are left with the aftermath, the long cooling of the hearth, and the question of what remains when the system designed to banish the cold finally loses its fuel. This final part is about the embers, the fragments of Roman winter that glowed on in the dark ages that followed, and the profound, unanswerable chill that settled over a world that had forgotten how to be collectively warm. Let's begin not with a grand collapse, but with a slow dimming. Picture a provincial capital in 5th century Gaul or Britain. The aqueducts that fed the great public baths have not been maintained. A few stretches have collapsed, and no one has the resources, the specialized knowledge, or the collective will to repair them. The bathhouse itself, once a bustling center of civic life and warmth, is now a cavernous, echoing shell. The Hypocaust system has fallen silent, the furnaces cold. Perhaps the lead pipes have been stripped for other uses, or the pillae stacks of bricks have been scavenged to build a cottage wall. The grand caldarium, where citizens once luxuriated in steam, might now house a few squatters who have built a crude fire in the center of the mosaic floor, the smoke blackening the high, decorated ceiling. The technology of public communal warmth has devolved into a private, desperate fire. This devolution is the central story of the post-Roman winter.
The vast, integrated machine of survival, the Annona supply ships, the state-run charcoal forests, the Legionary supply depots, shattered into a million local pieces. What survived was not the system, but the atomized knowledge and the simple tools. The dolium, the massive storage jar, gave way to smaller barrels and pits. The sophisticated conditum recipe for spiced wine might be forgotten, but the practice of warming whatever rough ale or wine you had with a hot poker certainly was not. The standardized military sagum cloak disappeared, but the weaving of thick, heavy woolens became, if anything, more essential than ever. The technology regressed, but the need was eternal. The true heirs to the Roman winter were not the Gothic or Frankish kings in their draughty stone halls. They were the monastic communities that dotted the European landscape. In many ways, a monastery of the 7th or 8th century became a deliberate, spiritualized echo of a Roman legionary fort. It was a self-contained community designed for survival in a hostile world. The Benedictine rule, with its strict rhythms of work and prayer, provided the discipline. Their agricultural and craft knowledge provided the means. The scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts, was often the only place, besides the church, where a fire was allowed for much of the day to keep the ink from freezing and the scribes' nings nimble. The monastery's garden, its herbarium, its cellars, and its brewery were a direct, continuous line from the Roman villa's focus on self-sufficiency. They preserved not just texts, but the practical Roman agronomy of Columella and Palladius in their libraries, texts that told them how to store apples or graft fruit trees, vital knowledge for enduring the lean months. The monk, huddled in his cowl by a single candle in the scriptorium, was the unlikely keeper of the flame, literal and cultural.
For the vast majority, the peasantry, winter became a tighter, more brutal contract with the land. The Roman idea of a right to warmth, embodied in the public baths and the grain dole, evaporated entirely. Warmth was now a direct product of your own labor and foresight. Your firewood was what you or your lord could coppice from the managed woodland. Your winter food was what you had managed to grow, dry, salt, or store in your own pit or crib. Your home was likely a single-room structure with a central hearth, the smoke seeping out through a hole in the roof, the walls made of wattle, daub, and whatever insulation could be found. The thermal efficiency of the pre-Roman roundhouse was often lost. Post-Roman structures were frequently cruder and draftier. Life contracted to a single, smoky, crowded, but vital space. The concept of a bedroom or a dining room was a memory of a warmer, more organized past. In this world, the psychological landscape of winter also changed. The Roman festivals, Saturnalia, the Lupercalia, were Christianized, their energies channeled into Christmas, Candlemas, and Lent. But the old fears remained, layered with new theology. The cold and dark were still associated with spiritual danger, with wolves, both literal and metaphorical, coming closer to the village stockade. The Norse myths that seeped into the Germanic consciousness of the era spoke of Fimbulwinter, the great winter that would precede the end of the world, a perfect metaphor for the experience of those living through the climactic downturn after Rome's fall, where a series of particularly harsh winters could indeed feel apocalyptic. And what of the ultimate legacy, the one written in the soil and the climate itself? Science now gives us a ghostly record of this transition. Analysis of pollen samples in lake beds and peat bogs shows a decline in the cultivation of more delicate, high-yield Roman crops like certain grapes and olives in northern regions, and a resurgence of hardier, less nutritious grains. The lead pollution in Greenland ice cores, a direct signal of extensive Roman mining and smelting, drops off precipitously around the 5th century, not to reach similar levels again for over 1,000 years. The world literally became quieter, cleaner, and colder.
The immense, continent-wide metabolism of the Roman economy slowed to a local subsistence pulse. So when we ask how the Romans survived winter, we are asking a question with two very different answers. For centuries, they survived it through a breathtaking application of collective power, logistical genius, and engineering arrogance. They moved mountains of fuel, rivers of grain, and armies of laborers to carve out pockets of perennial summer for the privileged and a baseline of managed survival for the many. But in the longer arc of history, they survived it the way all humans ultimately do, through resilience, through adapted knowledge, through community, and through a grim, patient endurance. Their grand technologies faded, but the lesson of the wool cloak, the stored seed, and the central hearth did not. The final image, then, is not of a freezing empire, but of a single, small fire. It burns in the center of a peasant's hut, in a monastic scriptorium, in a chieftain's longhouse built atop the stones of a Roman villa. The smoke carries the smells of cooking pottage, of damp wool, of humanity. It is a far cry from the invisible, radiant heat of a hypocaust floor. It is dirtier, needier, and more precarious, but it is also direct, democratic, and profoundly resilient. It is the fire that was lit before Rome and the fire that was kept burning after its light faded. The Roman winter was a magnificent, complicated interlude in humanity's long conversation with the cold. And when it was over, the conversation, whispered around a humble flame, simply continued in a different tongue. We have followed the warmth from its engineered peak to its flickering post-imperial ember. We've sat with the monk, the peasant, and the memory of the Hypocaust. But the story of the Roman winter is not yet fully told, because its shadow, or perhaps more accurately, its blueprint, lingered long after the last brazier in a Roman villa had cooled. It haunted the imagination and the architectural dreams of a colder, more fragmented Europe. This final part, the true end of our long, quiet monologue, is about that ghost. The ghost of Roman warmth in the walls of later centuries, and the quiet, philosophical coda it leaves us with.
For hundreds of years after the Western Empire's political dissolution, the physical ruins of its heating systems remained. They were puzzles. In the medieval period, a farmer plowing a field in Britain might unearth a grid of small, stacked bricks, the pile of a hypocaust. To him, it had no context. It might be seen as the work of giants or a forgotten magical people. A lord building a castle on the foundations of a Roman fort might find the same structures in the subfloor. Without the living knowledge of how they functioned, they were just curious masonry. But the idea they represented, of a building that was inherently warm, never completely died. It slept in the collective memory, a half-remembered dream of a more comfortable world. The conscious revival of Roman heating did not truly begin until the Renaissance, when humanists and antiquarians started systematically studying and romanticizing the classical past. When they excavated Roman villas and read Vitruvius's De Architectura, they rediscovered the Hypocaust. They called them stuve or stoves, and they were seen as marvels of lost ingenuity. The first attempts to recreate them were crude, often inefficient, and reserved for the palaces of popes and princes who fancied themselves the new Caesars. But the seed was replanted. The ghost had a name again. This revival was slow, partial, and filtered through medieval technology. The great innovation of the High Middle Ages was the walk-in fireplace and the chimney, which finally allowed heat to be effectively channeled out of a room, making larger, taller halls possible. This was a different path than the Roman radiant floor. But in some places, the two ideas merged. In monasteries, particularly in alpine regions, you find the kachelofen, the massive tile stove of Central and Eastern Europe. These are the spiritual, if not direct, descendants of the Hypocaust. They work on a similar principle of thermal mass. A firebox heats a labyrinth of flues within a large, often beautifully tiled ceramic mass. The tiles absorb the heat and then radiate it gently, evenly, and for hours after the fire has died down.
It is a localized, perfected version of the Roman wall tile system. The warmth is no longer underfoot, but it is still radiant, still patient, and still a centerpiece of the room. So the Roman solution did not return wholesale. It evolved. It was translated. The empire-wide system of fuel logistics was impossible to resurrect, but the principle of capturing and storing heat in masonry could be scaled down for a castle, a monastery, or a wealthy birder's home. The true legacy was not the specific technology, but the paradigm shift, the ambition that a building itself could be a heating system rather than just a container for a fire. This leads us to the final, quiet reflection. Our entire journey, from the senator's heated library to the legionary's barracks, from the cannibalized bathhouse to the peasant's hearth, reveals a fundamental tension in human history. It is the tension between the system and the individual, between the collective solution and the personal endurance. The Roman approach to winter was the ultimate systemic one. It reflected their worldview, order, disciplina, imposed on chaos, barbaria. The cold was a form of chaos, and they fought it with the same tools they used to fight everything else: standardized engineering, hierarchical command, and massive resource extraction. Their warmth was a product of empire. When that empire faltered, the system crumbled, and the individual was thrown back on their own resources, their local knowledge, and the strength of their immediate community. This pattern repeats itself far beyond the topic of heating. We see it in their aqueducts versus the village well, in their paved roads versus the dirt track, in their codified law versus local custom. Rome built systems of breathtaking scale and efficiency, but those systems were brittle. They required constant maintenance, energy, and political will. When those inputs failed, the systems became ruins, and people reverted to older, slower, more resilient modes of living.
And so, the story of the Roman winter is a microcosm of the Roman story itself. It is a tale of a brilliant, temporary victory over nature's constraints, won at a tremendous cost in labor, complexity, and ecological impact. It is a demonstration of what a highly organized civilization can achieve when it focuses its will on a problem. And it is also a demonstration of the impermanence of those achievements. In the end, the deepest answer to how did the Romans survive winter is this: they did, and then they didn't. Their specific, glorious methods faded, but the human determination to find warmth did not. That determination simply changed its form. It moved from the centralized furnace to the distributed hearth, from the imported Egyptian grain to the locally stored rye, from the state-issued cloak to the hand-woven blanket. As we sit in our own homes with our silent, invisible central heating, a system far more sophisticated and reliable than anything the Romans ever dreamed of, we are living in a new age of systemic warmth. Our comfort, too, depends on vast, fragile networks: the electrical grid, the natural gas pipeline, the global supply chain for insulation materials. We are the new Romans, in a way. We have, for the moment, banished the winter to the other side of our window panes. Perhaps the final lesson from their long, quiet struggle with the cold is one of humility. It is a reminder that our own comforts are historical anomalies, built on systems as complex and as vulnerable as the Hypocaust. And it is a reminder of the older, slower warmth that lies beneath all our technologies. The warmth of shelter, of shared food, of a fire around which to gather and tell stories against the deepening dark. That is the fire that never went out. The Romans built a magnificent temple around it, but the fire itself was always and will always be ours. We have arrived at the very edge of our inquiry, having traveled from the roaring furnace of the Hypocaust to the glowing embers of post-imperial fires. The story seems told, yet there remains a faint, persistent echo, a whisper not from the technologies themselves, but from the space they left behind, from the silence that followed their absence. This final passage is not about what they built, but about what was lost. Not about how they lived with the cold, but about the memory of their solution shaped the very concept of comfort in the Western mind. It's about the archaeology of an ambition and the ghost of a feeling. The feeling of being in one's own home, fundamentally separated from the natural world outside. Consider the difference between a Roman in his heated triclinium and a medieval lord in his drafty great hall. Both were elites, both had resources, but their experience of winter was philosophically different. The medieval lord was still in a dialogue with the cold. The hearth was massive, a roaring, theatrical focal point. It provided light and a circle of intense heat, but the shadows at the edge of the hall were cold. You felt the season's presence, you huddled closer to the flame. The cold was a palpable, respected adversary within the room itself. The Roman, by contrast, had sought to erase the adversary. The Hypocaust created a gentle, ambient, all-encompassing warmth. There was no single source. The heat came from the very floor and walls. The fire was hidden away in a service room, tended by unseen hands. In that room, winter was not an experienced reality, but a known abstraction, like a storm seen through thick, glazed glass. This created a different psychology of space. It created interiority. The interior room became a sealed world, a bubble of human-made climate. This was a profound step toward the modern idea of indoor and outdoor as separate, thermally distinct realms. The medieval hall was a shelter from the storm. The Roman villa's heated room was a denial of the storm's very existence.
And when that capacity for denial vanished for 1,000 years, its memory lingered as a kind of architectural melancholy. The ruins of bathhouses, those vast vaulted spaces, became known in later folklore not just as old buildings, but as places where the old people had somehow magically conjured summer in winter. They were places of legend, often associated with ghosts or spirits, perhaps the spirits of that lost comfort. The physical sensation of radiant heat from a floor was so alien to the medieval experience that it could only be explained as sorcery or a feat of a lost godlike race. The ghost in the walls was not just a memory of a system, but a memory of a sensation, the sensation of walking on a warm floor in January. This lost sensation points us to the most fragile and perhaps most Roman aspect of their winter survival, its dependence on silence. Our modern heating hums and clicks. A medieval hall crackled and roared. But the ideal Roman heating system was silent. The heat simply was. It was a background condition, like gravity. This silence was the ultimate luxury, bought with immense infrastructure and human toil. The slave stoking the furnace, the engineer cleaning the flues, all their labor was dedicated to creating an experience of effortless, quiet warmth for someone else. The system's success was measured by its own invisibility and inaudibility. When we today adjust a thermostat and feel warm air arrive without a sound, we are in a very direct line chasing that same Roman ideal. We have just replaced enslaved labor with fossil fuels and electrical engineering. Finally, we must confront the ecological whisper, the environmental cost that hummed beneath the silence. The Roman system of warmth was a consumer of landscapes. A single hypocaust in a large villa running for a season required acres of coppiced woodland. The public baths of a city like Rome consumed forest at an industrial scale. The legions on the frontier denuded the land around their forts for miles. This was not a sustainable model on a local level. It was made possible only by the empire's ability to draw resources from elsewhere and to move on when a local area was exhausted. Their warmth was, in a real sense, built on borrowed space and borrowed time. The cool-down of the empire was not just political or climatic, it was also, in places, a simple exhaustion of the fuel source. The land itself grew cold because it had been stripped of its capacity to create warmth. So what is the final whispered answer to our question? How did the Romans survive winter? They survived it by externalizing the cost.
They survived it by turning the problem of individual bodily cold into a vast project of collective engineering and resource extraction. They survived it by creating a psychological space where nature's cycles could be temporarily suspended. And then, when the externalization became impossible, when the logistics broke, the forests receded, and the labor could no longer be commanded, the system collapsed back in on itself. What remained was the individual body, the family hearth, the local knowledge, and the long, slow return to a negotiation with the cold that was far older than Rome. Our journey ends, then, not at a conclusion, but at a recognition of a cycle. The Roman winter was a magnificent, unsustainable peak in humanity's attempt to master climate. It shows us the zenith of what a pre-industrial society could achieve through organization and sheer will. And its absence shows us the resilience of simpler, slower ways of life. We are left with two endearing images forever in tension. The silent, warm floor of the villa, a masterpiece of human artifice, and the crackling, smoky hearth of the peasant, a masterpiece of human adaptation. One speaks to our ambition, the other speaks to our endurance. In the long, cold night of history, we have needed and will always need both. We have followed the path of warmth into silence, into memory, and into the very soil. We have contemplated systems and their ghosts. Yet to truly close this long, drowsy circuit, we must turn the question back upon ourselves. We, the audience in our climate-controlled rooms, listening to a story about ancient cold, we are the final piece of this history. The story of the Roman winter is not a remote curiosity. It is, in a quiet and persistent way, a soot-stained mirror held up to our own age. It reflects our own fragile comforts, our own hidden dependencies, and asks us what, in the end, the pursuit of warmth is really for. Let's begin with a simple anachronistic thought experiment. Imagine a Roman engineer, the man who designed Hypocausts, somehow transported to a modern suburban home in winter. He would, after the initial shock, likely be most confused by the uniformity of the warmth. For him, heat was gradated, a privilege that decreased with distance from the source. The caldarium was blazing hot, the tepidarium mild, the frigidarium cold. Social and thermal space were mapped together. The master's study was warm, the slave's quarters were not. In our homes, the thermostat creates a democratic monotony. The hallway, the bedroom, the kitchen, all are forced to the same temperature. Our Roman would find this bizarre, perhaps even decadent. We have achieved the ultimate Roman dream of erasing the chill, but we have done so not just for the elite in their private rooms, but for every corner of the common dwelling. We have universalized the experience that was the pinnacle of his elite ambition. The social signal of warmth is gone, only the bare sensation remains.
This leads to a second reflection. The Roman system was visceral in its cost. You saw the wood piles. You smelled the smoke. You heard the slaves tending the furnace. The connection between labor and comfort was direct, unignorable. Our system is abstracted. The warmth arrives silently from a vent. The cost is a number on a monthly bill, drawn from an account connected to labor performed somewhere else, entirely disconnected from the heat itself. We have perfected the Roman ideal of silent, effortless comfort by hiding the machinery, not just behind a wall, but behind a global market economy. Our equivalent of the slave stoking the furnace is the gas rig worker in the North Sea, the coal miner, the technician at the nuclear plant. We have not eliminated the human cost of our comfort. We have simply placed it over the horizon, out of sight and out of mind. We are all the senatorial class now, enjoying a warmth whose true source is conveniently remote. And what of the psychological world this creates? The Roman, even in his heated room, was acutely aware of the season. The architecture was designed to capture the low winter sun. The festivals marked the solstice. The change in diet was dramatic. Our sealed environments allow us to live in a state of perpetual climatic neutral. We can eat strawberries in December, wear light clothing indoors in January, and live by the glow of screens that know no night. We have not just overcome winter, we have begun to unlearn it. The Romans' year had a deep thermal rhythm. Ours is flattened. This is a profound, if quiet, loss. The comforting, predictable struggle, the drawing in, the storing up, the gathering around, that structured so much of pre-industrial life and bonded communities to their environment and to each other, has been replaced by a constant, easy sameness. We are warmer, but perhaps we are also less oriented. This brings us to the ultimate whispered question posed by the Roman experience. Is the goal of technology to free us from nature or to change our relationship with it? The Romans, in their heated villas, aimed for the former. They sought to create a human space where nature's rules did not apply. Their medieval successors accepted the latter. They built better shelters and better fires, but they remained in a conversation with the cold. Our modern path is decidedly Roman in its ambition. We seek total freedom. But the Roman story is a cautionary tale about the fragility of that freedom. It shows us that systems built on externalized costs and complex logistics are vulnerable to disruption, whether that disruption comes from political fracture, resource depletion, or climatic shift. So, as we near the end of this long, meandering talk, let us return to the simplest Roman technology of all, the one that outlasted the empire, the hearth. Not the grand fireplace of the medieval hall, but the simple central fire of a home. It was more than a heater. It was the light source, the kitchen, the storytelling circle, the family altar. Its warmth was social, optical, and spiritual as much as it was thermal. The Hypocaust provided a superior physical warmth, but it did so by disaggregating these functions. The heat came from below. The light came from lamps. The cooking was done elsewhere. It made comfort more efficient, but also more isolated. Our journey through the Roman winter, then, is not a linear story of progress. It is a story of a trade-off. We traded the integrated, multi-purpose, socially centered hearth for the specialized, silent, individual comfort of ambient heat. We traded a profound, seasonal rhythm for constant, easy neutrality. We traded a visible, tangible cost for an invisible, abstract one. The Romans show us the logical endpoint of one path, the path of mastery, of separation, of silent comfort won through systemic might. Their ghost asks us, in our far more powerful and far more vulnerable world of central heating and climate control, a simple question. What have we gained? And more importantly, what have we quietly left behind at the cold, dark edge of our perfectly warmed world? The answer isn't in their history. It's in the quality of our own silence, in the spaces between the hum of our furnaces, in the way we gather, or fail to gather, when the natural world outside our windows grows still and cold. Their story is over. Ours, warmed by their ambitions and shadowed by their frailties, continues. We have held the soot-stained mirror up to our own world and seen the reflections of our ambition, our fragility, our quiet losses. It feels we have reached a conclusion, a final whisper of history. But a story this long, this quiet, deserves not a conclusion, but a dissipation, a gentle fading, like the last warmth leaving a stone that has been carried from the hearth. We have one final, simple place to visit. It is not a grand ruin or a philosophical crossroads. It is a moment, a single mundane object, and the endless human ritual it represents. Let us pull back, far back from the empires and the systems. Forget the Hypocaust, the Legionary fort, the monk's scriptorium. Travel to a small, nameless farmstead in the province of Britannia, sometime in the late 4th century. The empire is still nominally here, but its pulse is weak. The roads are less traveled, the villas are being reclaimed by local styles. In this farmstead, a family prepares for nightfall in deep winter. They are not Roman citizens in the full sense, nor are they purely of the old tribes.
They are something in between, the product of centuries of slow blending. Their home is a simple rectangular building with a thatched roof and walls of timber and daub. At its center is a hearth, not a fancy fireplace, but a flat stone set in a bed of sand, surrounded by a low curb of other stones.
Here is our object, a simple, smooth river stone, about the size of a loaf of bread. It has been sitting in the edge of the fire all afternoon, absorbing the heat. As the family finishes their evening meal of pottage, the last of the salted pork boiled with barley and wilted greens from the cellar, the father, using a wooden paddle, carefully rolls this stone out of the fire's heart. He does not place it in a bronze hand warmer. He does not put it in a fancy foot stove. He wraps it in a piece of thick old wool cloth, worn soft from years of use. He then carries it, cradled like a sleeping child, to the sleeping area, a raised platform of timber and straw along the wall. He tucks this warm, wool-wrapped stone into the pile of blankets and furs where his family will sleep. This is the bedstone. It is one of the oldest, most universal heating technologies in human history, predating Rome by millennia and outlasting it by just as long. It requires no engineering, no empire, no logistics. It requires only a fire, a stone, and a piece of cloth. Its warmth is humble, localized, and fleeting. It will be cold by midnight. But for those first crucial hours of sleep, it drives the deep chill from the bedding. It is warmth distilled to its absolute essence. Captured solar energy, the fire, stored in mass, the stone, transferred directly to the body. It is the antithesis of the Hypocaust. It is personal, tangible, and leaves no permanent mark on the earth. The ritual of the bedstone is the quiet beating heart underneath the entire grand narrative we have explored. While emperors boasted of heated floors and legions built forts to store fuel, in a million humble homes across the empire and beyond it, this same simple act was performed night after night, winter after winter. It was the warmth of the powerless, the warmth of the local, the warmth that asked for no permission and required no system. It was the baseline human defense against the dark and cold. And here, in this fading light of our story, we see the ultimate truth. The Roman winter was not one story, but two stories braided together. One is the story of the system, loud, impressive, fragile, and destined to leave magnificent ruins. The other is the story of the ritual, quiet, repetitive, resilient, and destined to leave no trace at all. You will not find the bedstone in an archaeological report. The stone itself, once cool, is just a stone. The cloth disintegrates. The action leaves no signature in the soil. Its history is written only in the muscle memory of generations, in the universal human knowledge that a warm weight in the bed makes the night shorter and kinder. So, what is the final legacy of the Roman winter? It is not the ruin of the bathhouse, though that stands as a monument to their ambition. It is not the blueprint for our furnaces, though that line of descent is real. The final lingering legacy is this. They showed, in the most dramatic terms possible, the distance between the systemic and the ritualistic paths to survival. They built a civilization that tried, heroically and fatally, to scale the ritual of the bedstone to the size of an empire, to turn a personal comfort into a public right, to make the fleeting, portable warmth of a stone into a permanent architectural condition. They succeeded for a while, and then their system, as all systems must, returned to the earth. But the ritual of the bedstone, the search for simple, direct warmth in the heart of a home, never ceased. It continued in the cold castles of the Middle Ages, in the cottages of the early modern period, in the form of bed warmers and hot water bottles, and it continues today in our electric blankets and our down comforters. We have just found new ways to heat the stone. Our long, quiet journey ends here then,
Not with a bang from a collapsing empire, but with the soft thud of a warm stone being placed at the foot of a bed. It is a gesture that a Roman peasant, a Celtic farmer, a medieval serf, and a modern person would all understand instantly. It is the universal, unspoken coda to the human struggle with winter. All the engineering, all the politics, all the economics, it all either serves this simple need or it is just noise. The Romans made the most beautiful, complex, and grandiose noise the world had ever heard on the subject. But in the silent darkness of a winter night, it was always the humble, warm stone that truly mattered. The ghost in the walls was never the ghost of the Hypocaust. It was the ghost of the people who lived there, performing their small, vital rituals of warmth. And that ghost is not a phantom, it is us, every time we seek a little comfort against the chill. The story of how the Romans survived winter is, in the end, simply the longest and most elaborate footnote to that most basic, most eternal human act. Good night. We've reached a point beyond epilogues. The story has been told, the embers have faded to ash, and the final universal sigh of warmth has been heard. To continue in the main narrative would be to circle back on itself, to rekindle a fire that has already been allowed to die naturally into a soft, gray conclusion.
However, the spirit of the sleepless historian, that gentle, meandering, deeply detailed exploration, permits one final, quiet movement. Not a continuation of the story, but an exploration of the warm shadow it casts. Let us turn our gaze from the Romans themselves and look at what grew in the long, cool twilight after their imperial summer. For the end of the Roman system of winter did not create a vacuum, it created a space. And into that space flowed new stories, new adaptations, and new cultural understandings of cold that were all, in some way, defined by the memory of what had been lost. Let's drift north and forward in time to the world of the so-called barbarian kingdoms that filled the space left by Rome in the west. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Their leaders did not move into icy wildernesses, they moved into a landscape of ruins that whispered of a different way to live. A Visigothic king setting up his court in Toulouse or Toledo would have chosen, almost invariably, to inhabit a surviving Roman villa or administrative complex. He would have walked on those Hypocaust floors, though the system was dead. He would have bathed in the great piscinae, though they were dry or used for storage. This physical immersion in the skeleton of Roman comfort must have been a constant, haunting education. They were living inside the ghost. Their own traditions of warmth were of a different character. The Great Hall, the Mead Hall of Anglo-Saxon poetry, was the new thermal heart of power. Its warmth was the opposite of the Roman silent radiance. It was a performative warmth. The central, long hearth was the stage. The king or lord sat in the place of greatest heat and light, and his thanes sat in ranks down the hall, their status literally measured by their proximity to the fire. The warmth was communal, but also hierarchical in a visceral, immediate way you could feel on your skin. It was loud with crackling logs, boasting, and the scrape of benches. It was a warmth of presence and social bonding, not of private, engineered comfort. The Roman had bought his isolation from the season. The Germanic lord commanded his people to gather within the season's light of circle. This shift from an architectural solution to a social one is profound. When the Roman system failed, the responsibility for warmth fell back onto the social unit. The duty of the Lord was not to maintain a complex heating infrastructure, but to provide the fuel and the feast, the literal hearth and home. The concept of hospitality, so central to early medieval law and legend, was fundamentally a contract about warmth. To deny a traveler a place by your fire was a grave moral and legal crime.
The warmth was no longer a civic right provided by a distant state, but a personal obligation enforced by honor and custom. And what of the common people in this new, colder world? Here we see the ultimate triumph of the ritual over the system. Without the Roman logistical machine, survival became hyper-local. The knowledge of which trees burned hottest and longest, oak and ash, not pine, how to bank a peat fire to smolder through the night, how to build a cruse or cruck house with thick insulating walls of wattle, daub, and moss. This was the vital knowledge. The Roman dolium was replaced by the subterranean storage pit, the Grubenhaus, which used the constant, cool temperature of the earth itself. Their winter was a deeper collaboration with immediate materials. This post-Roman world also developed a new mythology of cold. In the Norse sagas that would soon echo through the northern world, cold was not just a discomfort, it was an active, apocalyptic force. Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter, was 3 successive winters with no summer in between, a prelude to the final battle of Ragnarok. This was a poetic rendering of a very real fear that the climatic downturn following Rome's fall might not end. The cold could win. The Romans saw winter as a problem of engineering. The early medieval person often saw it as a test of cosmic and moral endurance. Yet the Roman shadow was still there. It was there in the Latin words that seeped into the new languages for concepts of comfort. The Old English wall, from vallum, a wall for a structure that encloses. The Frankish adoption of concepts of stone construction. It was there in the Christian Church, the one institution that preserved Roman administrative habits. Monasteries, as we noted, became islands of systematic warmth, their calefactorium, warming room, a direct, purposeful echo of the Roman tepidarium, a place where monks could thaw their ink and their fingers before copying texts. The church also preserved the Roman calendar, with its midwinter festival of Christmas deliberately placed to absorb and redirect the energy of Saturnalia and the Sol Invictus, creating a new spiritual light in the darkness.
So the story does not end with the bedstone. It flows into the hearth of the mead hall, the cloister of the monastery, and the peat fire of the peasant's cruck house. The Roman winter, as a system, was gone, but its absence became the defining condition for the winters that followed. It created a world where warmth had to be re-earned, renegotiated, and reinvested with new social and spiritual meaning. The quest was the same, to find comfort against the cold, but the answers, after Rome, were no longer written in brick and bureaucracy. They were written in social bonds, in local knowledge, in poetry, and in the shared, fragile light of a single fire around which everyone huddled, telling tales of giants, gods, and a lost age when floors were magically warm. The memory of that magic, that Roman ambition, became the backdrop against which all subsequent winters were felt. It was the warmth they remembered, and in remembering, defined everything that came after as a kind of long, resilient, and communal chill. Our journey has taken us from imperial furnaces to barbarian halls, following the warmth as it retreated from a public system to a private social ritual. We must now turn to the institution that acted as the vital bridge across this chilling gulf, the monastery. In the long centuries after Rome's political collapse, as kingdoms fractured and classical knowledge flickered, these enclosed communities became the new custodians of warmth, not the profligate, fuel-hungry warmth of the bathhouse, but a calculated, contractual warmth. Theirs was a deliberate and spiritual pact with the cold, one that preserved the ghost of Roman order while submitting to a new, sterner discipline. Imagine the typical Benedictine monastery of the 8th or 9th century, perhaps on a wind-swept site in Northumbria or the Frankish north. Its very layout was a thermal strategy. The complex was a self-contained world, surrounded by a wall that broke the wind.
The church, the cloister, the dormitory, the refectory, and the scriptorium were all arranged around an interior courtyard, creating a sheltered microclimate. This was the Roman atrium principle, stripped of luxury and repurposed for collective spiritual survival. Within this enclave, heat was not a right, but a regulated concession. The Benedictine rule, the governing document for thousands of monks across Europe, is strikingly specific about cold. It permitted the wearing of additional garments in winter, recognizing the body's weakness. More tellingly, it designated the one heated space, the calefactorium, or warming room. This was the single vital exception to the general rule of unheated stone. Here, a fire was allowed, so that monks, whose liturgical duties required them to rise for prayers in the dead of night and who spent hours in the frigid scriptorium copying manuscripts, could prevent their fingers from becoming too numb to write or their voices from ceasing in chant. The warmth was a tool for work, not for leisure. It was a utilitarian piety. The scriptorium itself was the cold, beating heart of this contract. Here, the preservation of classical and sacred knowledge depended on a constant low-grade battle with the temperature. Ink would freeze, parchment would become stiff and brittle. The scribe's hand, if too cold, would lose its precise control, ruining a week's labor. The solution was a mix of microengineering and personal endurance. Small enclosed braziers might be used, though the risk of fire near precious manuscripts was terrifying. More often, warmth was personal and minimal. A small, flat stone warmed at the nearby calefactorium fire and placed under the writing desk, or the monk's own woolen cowl pulled tightly around hunched shoulders. The work was slow, the light was poor, and the cold was a persistent third presence in the room. A demon of error and distraction, to be resisted through sheer shivering will. This monastic relationship with cold reshaped the very knowledge they preserved. The classical texts on agriculture by Roman authors like Calemula or Palladius were copied not as historical curiosities, but as vital survival manuals. They provided the know-how to manage the monastery's lands, its gardens, its orchards, and its woodlots, the entire economic engine that produced the food and, critically, the fuel for that single sanctioned fire. The monastery's warmth was directly funded by its agricultural surplus. In this, they replicated the Roman villa's self-sufficiency, but on a spiritualized, communal scale. They were not heating a bath for pleasure. They were fueling a scriptorium for God.
Thus, the monk became the archetype of a new kind of winter endurance. His warmth was earned, measured, and purposeful. It stood in stark contrast to the vanished profligacy of the Roman noble and the boisterous, fuel-wasting hearth of the Germanic lord. The monastery's legacy was a paradox. It kept the flame of classical learning alive by submitting to an aesthetic of chosen cold. It taught the West that intellectual and spiritual work could, and perhaps should, be conducted in conditions of disciplined discomfort. The warmth of the calefactorium was not an end in itself. It was a brief respite that made the return to the beautiful, austere cold of the church or the scriptorium possible. In the long history of seeking warmth, the monks introduced a radical idea that the cold could be not just an enemy, but a partner in devotion. From the disciplined chill of the monastery, let us float to another iconic post-Roman structure, the stone castle of the High Middle Ages. If the monastery made a contract with the cold for spiritual ends, the castle did so for military and social power. It represents the apex of a world where warmth was a logistical challenge won through raw resources and feudal authority. A world that had fully internalized the loss of Roman systemic comfort and built its own, colder order upon the ruins. Enter the great hall of a 12th century Norman keep like the Tower of London or Rochester Castle. The first overwhelming sensation is of stone. Cold, damp, massive stone. Any heat generated here is fighting a perpetual, losing battle against the sheer thermal mass of the walls.
The central hearth, placed in the middle of the floor, is a dramatic improvement over the open pit of the earlier mead hall, but its design is brutally inefficient. Much of the heat rises straight up to the timber roof, while smoke collects under the rafters before seeping out through louvered openings or simply filling the upper half of the hall with a pungent haze. The warmth is a localized phenomenon. You are either in the circle of direct radiance, close to the Lord's high table, or you are in the progressively colder, darker margins. Social and thermal geography are perfectly aligned. The private chambers of the Lord and Lady, the solar, were a slight advancement. Often located on an upper floor above the hall's heat, they might feature a small fireplace set into the wall, a key technological shift from the central hearth. The fireplace, with its chimney, could direct more smoke out and allow for a more contained heat. But these rooms remained cavernous and drafty. Tapestries hung on the walls were not mere decoration, they were functional insulation, trapping a thin layer of still air against the weeping stone. Rushes on the floor, frequently changed, provided some barrier against the damp chill rising from below. Warmth was a constant, active project, maintained by an army of servants hauling firewood, adjusting tapestries, and heating bed-warming pans filled with hot coals. For the castle garrison and the lesser inhabitants, warmth was even scarcer. Soldiers slept in guard rooms or barracks that were little more than stone shells, huddled around braziers. The real innovation for the common soldier was not in architecture, but in personal kit. The evolution of the gambeson, a thick, quilted cloth armor, was as much about surviving garrison duty in a drafty tower as it was about battle. Worn under mail or alone, it provided essential, portable insulation. Similarly, the hauberk of mail, while cold to the touch initially, once worn close to the body, acted as a surprisingly effective layer of metal wool, trapping body heat. The castle, therefore, teaches us that post-Roman warmth was fundamentally about concentration and exclusion. The resources, the vast quantities of firewood from the Lord's domain's woods, the skilled labor to maintain fireplaces, the wool for tapestries and clothing, were all concentrated at the top of the social pyramid. The castle was not designed to be uniformly warm, it was designed to demonstrate who could command warmth. The Lord,
his solar with a fireplace, was a step closer to the old Roman ideal of private comfort than anyone else in his domain. His hall showcased his ability to provide a circle of warmth for his retainers, a powerful tool of patronage. For everyone else, the cold was an accepted, pervasive condition of life within the very walls that were supposed to shelter them. This was the great divergence from the Roman model. The Roman Hypocaust, for all its elitism, was a silent background system. The medieval castle's warmth was performative and noisy. It crackled, smoked, and required constant attention. It was not a solved problem, but a daily, visible conquest. The castle stands as a monument not to comfort, but to the immense effort required to carve out a small, defended pocket of warmth in a world that had forgotten how to build it into the foundations. We have dwelt in the castles and monasteries, the seats of power and piety, where warmth was a calculated commodity. But to understand the true texture of the medieval winter, we must descend from the stone keep and enter the world that fueled it, the village. Here, in the peasant's cottage, the struggle for warmth was stripped of all ceremony and reduced to its most elemental economic terms. The central artifact of this life was the hearth, and its story is bound up with one of the most revealing taxes in history, the hearth tax. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as populations grew and land was cleared, firewood began its transition from a common right to a valuable, taxable asset. The open hearth in the center of a peasant's single-room cottage was more than a source of heat and light. It was the crucible for all cooking, the social center, and increasingly, a measurable unit of wealth for the Lord's tax collector. The very smoke that seeped out through the thatch was a signal of an economic activity. The hearth tax, levied in various forms across Europe, was a simple, brutal calculation. The
The tax assessor would count the number of hearths or smoke holes in a village. Each one represented a household with the means to maintain a fire and thus a capacity to pay. This had profound social and architectural consequences. In some regions, it encouraged the crowding of multiple family units into a single dwelling to share one taxable hearth. In others, it spurred ingenious attempts at concealment, false walls, hidden flues, or the simple, risky act of letting the fire die to cold ashes on the day the assessor came. The warmth of your home was now directly linked to your fiscal visibility. Within the cottage, the technology was ancient and pragmatic. The cruck frame building, with its arched timbers supporting a roof that reached almost to the ground, created a space that was relatively easy to heat. The walls were wattle and daub, a lattice of sticks plastered with a mix of clay, dung, and straw, which provided decent insulation. The floor was packed earth, often covered with rushes or straw that was changed periodically. The heat from the central fire rose, warming the sleeping area in the loft above. But this system had a critical flaw: smoke. Without an efficient chimney, a technology slow to trickle down from castles, the room was constantly filled with an eye-watering haze. The term smoke bay was literal. The upper portion of the cottage was often blackened with soot, and respiratory ailments were chronic. The peasants' relationship with fuel was one of anxious stewardship. Common rights to gather deadwood from the Lord's forest were fiercely defended, as purchasing wood was a major expense. Alternatives were crucial. Peat, cut from bogs in the summer and dried, was a common fuel in many regions, burning with a slow, sour smoke. Dried dung was another resource, collected and formed into cakes. The quality of your fire, and thus the quality of your warmth in cooking, was a direct reflection of your diligence in summer and your standing in the complex manorial economy. Thus, the medieval peasant winter was a season of contraction and introspection, but under a new layer of economic pressure. The family contracted into its single smoky room. Life was oriented around the hearth, not just for comfort, but because it was the only source of light and hot food. The stories told, the crafts practiced, the very rhythms of sleep and waking were dictated by the fire's needs. But over it all hung the knowledge of the tax, a reminder that even this humble, essential warmth was not truly their own. It was a resource extracted from the land they worked, and a portion of its symbolic value was owed upward to the lord in his castle, who used it to fund his own, larger but equally tenuous conquest of the cold.
We have felt the smoky heat of the cottage and the damp chill of the castle. There is one more medieval space we must enter to complete the picture, one that represents the ultimate spiritualization of the cold, the Gothic cathedral. If the monastery's calefactorium was a concession to mortal weakness, the great cathedral of the 13th century was a deliberate, breathtaking surrender to the atmosphere of winter. It was not built to be warm, it was built to be transcendent, and its relationship with cold was central to that ambition. Step inside Chartres, or Amiens, or Notre Dame de Paris on a winter's day. The air is still and frigid, far colder than the outside air which has been moving in the sun. Your breath plumes before you. The sheer scale, the soaring vaults, the long nave, makes any thought of heating the space laughable. The architects and clergy knew this. The cathedral's winter was an accepted, even instrumental condition. The cold served a purpose. It heightened the contrast between the mortal world and the divine. The stone of the pillars was cold to the touch, like a tomb. The space encouraged a physical state of hushed stillness. To move was to feel the cold more keenly. The primary source of warmth in this space was not thermal, but visual, the stained glass windows. This is the critical point. In the deep winter, with the sun low in the sky, the light passing through these windows was weak in lumen, but incredibly rich in color. Reds, blues, and golds would cast pools of jewel-toned light across the cold stone floor. This light was understood as a metaphor for divine grace and spiritual warmth. A medieval worshipper, shivering in a woolen cloak, would not have looked at the windows and wished for more sunlight. They would have seen in those radiant, non-heating colors a promise of a warmth beyond the physical, the warmth of salvation. The cold of the body focused the mind on the warmth of the spirit. The rituals of the church calendar embraced this cold. The celebration of Christmas, placed at the winter solstice, was a festival of light in darkness. Candles, precious and expensive, were used in profusion, their small, living flames a direct, vulnerable counterpoint to the vast frozen stone. The feast of the Presentation, Candlemas, in early February, involved the blessing of candles, literally stocking up on portable, blessed light against the lingering dark. The physical discomfort of the worshipper was not an accident to be remedied, but a part of the penitential and anticipatory experience of the season.
Furthermore, the cathedral's construction was a seasonal feat in itself. The great building campaigns relied on the winter. Stone was quarried in the summer and autumn, then dragged on sledges over frozen ground or icy roads in the winter when the mud of other seasons would have made transport impossible. The cold was a tool that enabled the cathedral's very existence. The workers, housed in temporary lodges, would have huddled around fires, their labor a direct confrontation with the elements to create a space that would forever enshrine the feeling of majestic, celestial cold. Thus, the Gothic cathedral represents the final majestic divorce of the concept of warmth from mere physical sensation in medieval culture. It created a hierarchy of comfort. The body was meant to be cold and humble. The soul was to be warmed by colored light and divine promise. In doing so, it completed a journey that began when the Roman Hypocaust fell silent. Warmth had moved from being a systemic, physical guarantee for the elite to a social obligation in the hall, to a taxable resource in the cottage, and finally, in the cathedral, to a purely spiritual metaphor. The medieval world had learned to build spaces that mastered many things: height, light, structure, but it let the cold in, and in doing so, taught itself to find a different kind of warmth altogether. The great age of cathedral building began to wane, and the dense, localized world of the Middle Ages started to stir with new currents of thought, trade, and disease. The 14th century brought the Black Death and the Little Ice Age, twin catastrophes that made the European winter suddenly sharper, more lethal, and laden with existential terror. In this final part of our medieval sojourn, we see the old strategies of warmth strained to breaking point, and the first faint glimmers of a return to a different ideal, a remembered Roman ideal. The climatic downturn of the Little Ice Age, beginning in the early 1300s, was not a sudden freeze, but a creeping instability. Winters became longer, colder, and more unpredictable. Glaciers advanced in the Alps, vineyards failed in England, the Thames froze over repeatedly. For a peasant population already living at the margin, this was a disaster. The carefully managed fuel stocks proved inadequate. Harvests failed with grim regularity, leading not just to hunger, but to a lack of straw and grain residue that could be burned. The hearth cacks became even crueler when the hearth itself could not be kept lit for lack of fuel. The smokeless fire, the cold hearth, became a symbol of poverty and despair. In the crowded, unsanitary towns, the winter cold now collaborated with epidemic disease. The Yersinia pestis bacterium, carried by fleas on rats, thrived in the summer, but its aftermath in the depopulated, broken communities was felt most keenly in the winter. Survivors huddled in houses made emptier by death, the social and thermal fabric of their lives torn apart. The medieval communal systems for enduring winter, the manorial obligations, the guild protections, were shattered by the scale of the mortality. The cold of the 14th century was not just a physical phenomenon, it was the climate of a broken contract. Yet, from this crisis emerged the first tentative movements back toward a Roman concept of comfort. In the Italian city-states, particularly in Florence and Venice, wealth from trade and banking began to concentrate in the hands of a new mercantile elite, not a feudal nobility. These men, who saw themselves as the heirs to Roman civic virtue, looked at their drafty, fortified townhouses and found them wanting. They began to study the Roman ruins around them with new eyes, not as the haunted works of giants, but as the achievable engineering of a superior civilization. The rediscovery of the Hypocaust began as a scholarly and then an architectural fantasy. The humanist architect Leon Battista Alberti, in his 15th century treatise De Re Edificatria, described Roman heating systems with precise admiration. The wealthy merchant reading such works desired not the performative, smoky warmth of the Great Hall, but the silent, refined, private warmth he read about in Vitruvius and Alberti. The first attempts were crude. They built stufae, rooms with furnaces and flues running under floors, but the knowledge was imperfect, the cost prohibitive. The dream, however, was replanted. This shift was cultural as much as technological. The medieval world had viewed excessive bodily comfort with suspicion as a distraction from God. The emerging Renaissance spirit saw the cultivation of a comfortable, beautiful, and human-centered environment as a virtue. The ideal was the balanced climate, the temperamentum. The fireplace, evolving from the crude castle hearth into an elegant, decorated focal point in a paneled study, was the first step. It concentrated heat more efficiently and made a room habitable. But the ultimate aspiration, glowing in the minds of the new elite, was the invisible, even warmth of the ancients. So, the long medieval winter, which began with the loss of a system and the embrace of a social and spiritual negotiation with the cold, ended with that negotiation failing under climatic and demographic pressure. In the chaos, a memory resurfaced. It was the ghost of the Hypocaust, no longer seen as magic or sorcery, but as a lost science. The medieval period had taught Europe how to endure, how to share, and how to spiritualize the cold. The Renaissance was about to rekindle the old Roman question, how to abolish it. The stage was set for a very different kind of fire to be lit, one fueled not just by wood, but by the rediscovered dreams of a vanished empire. The draft from the ancient world, felt for centuries as a haunting chill, was about to become a breath of inspiration. The world was slowly thawing from the long medieval winter, not just in climate, but in imagination. We left off as the Renaissance merchant, flush with gold florins and classical texts, gazed at his drafty palazzo with dissatisfaction. He embodied a pivotal shift, the commercial reclamation of comfort. Warmth, which had been a military asset for the Lord and a spiritual metaphor for the church, was becoming a domestic commodity, a thing to be bought, engineered, and displayed as a testament to one's taste and learning. This part of our story is about that transition, played out not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet, proud spaces of the urban home and the revolutionary medium of print.
Let's step into the studiolo of a 15th century Florentine merchant, Francesco. His wealth comes from wool and banking, not land and swords. The room is small, wood-paneled, and intensely private, a world away from the cavernous Great Hall. Its centerpiece is a new innovation, a decorated fireplace with a carved mantel, perhaps showing scenes from mythology. This is not just a heat source, it is a statement. The fire is contained, its smoke drawn neatly up a chimney breast designed by a noted mason. A fireback of cast iron radiates heat more efficiently into the room. Francesco's warmth is managed, aesthetic, and personal. He sits in a carved chair, wrapped in a fine wool gown lined with fur, a classical symbol of status, now a practical luxury, reading a newly printed copy of Vitruvius's De Architectura. The Roman text is no longer a fragile manuscript in a monastic library, it is a reproducible object in his hands.
This is the crucial link, the printing press. The dream of Roman heating, once confined to a handful of precious codices, could now be mass-produced and disseminated. Architectural treatises by Alberti, Serlio, and Palladio, filled with diagrams and descriptions of Roman baths and hypocausts, rolled off the presses of Venice and Rome. They became the aspirational catalogs for a new elite. A gentleman in England or France could now study the precise proportions of a Roman tepidarium without ever leaving his estate. The knowledge of ancient comfort became democratized among the literate and wealthy, fueling a continent-wide desire to replicate it. The ghost in the walls now had a detailed instruction manual. The first attempts were often symbolic rather than functional. Nobles built Roman baths in their country houses, cold, decorative grottos with statuary and mosaics, but no actual heating. They were stage sets for classical fantasy. But the ambition was real. In England, Cardinal Wolsey installed Roman-style heating at his lavish Hampton court in the 1520s, a system of flues and furnaces that was a bold, if only partially successful, experiment. The goal was clear: to move beyond the medieval hearth, which warmed the front of your body while your back froze, toward an ambient, enveloping warmth. This pursuit catalyzed material innovation. The inefficient open hearth gave way to the enclosed stove, particularly in the colder climates of Germany and Central Europe. The Kachelofen, that towering tiled masterpiece we glimpsed earlier, reached its zenith. Each ceramic tile was a heat battery, and the ornate designs, biblical scenes, coats of arms, geometric patterns, turned the heater into the most expensive and important piece of furniture in the home. It was a hybrid, a medieval technology of mass and radiation, refined to Renaissance levels of artistry and efficiency, inspired by the Roman principle of stored heat. It was warmth as a permanent, beautiful, and central household god. Yet, for all this progress, a deep irony remained. While the merchant in his studiolo might dream of silent hypocausts, his comfort was still fundamentally powered by the same thing as the peasants: human labor. The difference was in the degree of separation. An army of servants, the unseen modern counterparts to Roman slaves, chopped the wood, carried the coal, cleaned the ashes, and maintained the flues. The Renaissance house created more specialized spaces for warmth: the study, the withdrawing room, the bedchamber with its warming pan, which in turn required more specialized, invisible labor to sustain them. The democratization of the idea of Roman warmth did not mean a democratization of its experience. It created a new hierarchy based on access to technology, fuel, and service. Thus, the period from the 15th to the 17th centuries established the template for modern domestic warmth. It shifted the locus from the communal hall to the private room. It married the ambition of classical engineering with medieval craft and new artistic sensibilities. And it made the pursuit of comfort a core project of civilized life, driven by books, trade, and a growing confidence that the environment could and should be shaped to human will. The fire was no longer just a defense against the dark. It was a tool for crafting a better, more comfortable, more Roman-inspired world within one's own four walls. The next great revolution would not be in the idea, but in the fuel itself.
For millennia, the story of warmth had been a story of biology, of burning the recent products of the sun: wood, charcoal, peat, straw, dung. Its rhythm was seasonal, its supply limited by geography and land rights. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, first in Britain and then across northern Europe, the story was rewritten with a new, darker protagonist: coal. This was the mineral sun, the stored solar energy of ancient forests mined from the earth. Its adoption did not just change the temperature of rooms, it changed the fundamental economics, logistics, and even the social meaning of heat. The shift began out of necessity. In Britain, particularly around London, the great forests had been decimated for shipbuilding, construction, and charcoal for iron smelting. Wood fuel became scarce and exorbitantly expensive.
The poor, as always, felt it first. They turned to sea coal, a low-grade sulfurous coal mined from coastal cliffs and shipped to London. It was a fuel of desperation. It smoked abominably, coating interiors in a sticky black grime, and its acrid fumes were considered a health hazard. Wealthy households, with their large, well-ventilated halls and a cultural aversion to the smell, resisted it for as long as they could, clinging to expensive imported firewood. The technology that forced coal's acceptance was the chimney. The medieval open hearth was useless for coal. It produced too much smoke and not enough draft. The widespread adoption of the narrow, vertical chimney stack in the late 16th century created the necessary airflow. Suddenly, coal could burn in a dedicated fireplace. This technological marriage, coal and the chimney, began to alter architecture. Rooms could be smaller and ceilings lower as the heat was more effectively directed. The fireplace became smaller, more ornate, and the focal point of the wall, not the center of the room. This had a subtle but profound social effect. The great hall, with its communal hearth, began its long decline. Wealthy families retreated to smaller, coal-heated parlors and withdrawing rooms. Warmth became more intimate, more private, and more exclusive. The household fragmented into smaller, thermally distinct units. The lord and lady dined in a warm dining room, the servants ate in a colder hall or kitchen. Coal, though cheaper per unit of heat than wood, required a new infrastructure of grates, scuttles, and tools, and a constant dirty labor of maintenance. It reinforced social divisions, even as it seemed to democratize access to fuel. Meanwhile, the poor in cities like London had no such luxuries. They burned cheap coal in crude, poorly ventilated grates. The famous London pea super fogs were in fact coal smog events, a toxic cocktail of smoke and river mist. For the urban poor, winter warmth now came with a literal cost to breath and health. Theirs was a toxic warmth, a bitter trade-off. In the countryside, the old rhythms persisted longer, but even there, coal from new mines began to supplement dwindling wood supplies. The psychological impact of coal was as significant as the physical. Wood fires are alive. They crackle, spark, and change as they burn. They have a fragrance. A coal fire is more industrial, a steady, glowing mass, less expressive, more predictable. It turns heating into a matter of fueling a furnace rather than tending a living flame. It represents a step further away from the natural world and toward a mineral, geological timescale. The Roman Hypocaust had hidden the fire entirely. The coal fireplace hid the source of the fuel, the dark, dangerous mine, but kept the fire itself as a domesticated, if dirtier, icon of home. By the late 17th century, coal had reshaped the map of warmth. It created national industries and powered imperial expansion. The Royal Navy ran on Baltic timber, but the industries that supplied it ran on British coal. It made the intensive heating of large cities like London possible for the first time.
Time since Rome, but at the cost of horrific air pollution. It set the stage for the next, even greater revolution, the steam engine, which would turn the heat from burning coal into mechanical power, forever changing humanity's relationship with energy. The quest for personal warmth had, almost accidentally, unlocked the fuel that would power the modern world. The hearth was becoming a furnace, and the home was becoming a tiny outpost of a vast subterranean energy system. The 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, brought a new obsession: measurement. The natural world was to be quantified, classified, and understood by reason. This spirit inevitably turned its gaze upon the subjective, bodily experience of warmth and cold. The result was a conceptual revolution that sought to remove feeling from the realm of the qualitative and place it on a numerical scale. The story of warmth was no longer just about fuel and fireplaces. It was about gradients, equilibrium, and controlled experiments. The key instrument in this revolution was the thermometer. Invented in the previous century, it was perfected and popularized in the 1700s. For the first time, cold and hot could be assigned numbers, degrees Fahrenheit or Réaumur. This had an immediate disorienting effect. A gentleman scientist could now prove that his chilly drawing room was in fact 58 degrees Fahrenheit, while his neighbor's cozy study was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Comfort became data. The very language of thermal experience began to change, moving from descriptive, bitter, bracing, stifling, toward the numerical. This new precision fed directly into architectural theory and the pursuit of the perfectly balanced climate. Enlightenment thinkers, steeped in classical ideals, saw the Roman bath sequence, frigidarium, tepidarium, caldidarium, not just as a luxury, but as a rational progression of temperatures for the body's benefit. They sought to engineer this balance into the home. The goal was temperamentum, a uniform, moderate, and healthy atmosphere. Drafts were now identified not just as discomforts, but as vectors of disease. Elaborate systems of stove heating from Germany and Sweden, which used slow-burning coal or wood to heat air in a central furnace, then channel it through ducts to multiple rooms, were studied and admired. They promised the even, silent heat of a Roman hypocaust, but with 18th century physics. The most famous embodiment of this ideal was the Franklin stove, invented by Benjamin Franklin in 1741. Franklin, the archetypal Enlightenment man, was disgusted by the inefficiency of the traditional fireplace, which sent most of its heat up the chimney. His design, a freestanding iron stove placed inside the fireplace, used a labyrinth of flues to extract more heat from the smoke before it escaped. It was a rational machine for warmth, designed to save fuel and improve health. Its success was a triumph of applied reason over tradition. In the grand country houses of England, this rationalism took a more lavish form. Architects like Robert Adam designed houses with sophisticated central heating systems inspired by Roman models. At Kettleston Hall or Harewood House, furnaces in the basement heated air, which was then circulated through hollow floors and spaces behind walls. Grills in the rooms allowed the warm air to enter silently. It was a direct, conscious revival of the Hypocaust, now powered by coal and informed by Newtonian physics. The wealthy inhabitant could walk from room to room, experiencing a near-uniform temperature, a literal enactment of the Enlightenment ideal of a regulated, harmonious environment.
Yet this remained the privilege of a tiny few. For the vast majority, warmth was still a crude local struggle. The thermometer might tell a cottager that his home was at an unhealthy 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but that knowledge was useless without the means to change it. The Enlightenment's great contribution was to define the ideal of thermal comfort with scientific clarity. It created a benchmark, a specific, measurable range of temperature and airflow that was conducive to health and intellectual activity. It made the old, smoky, uneven medieval warmth seem not just uncomfortable, but irrational and backward. In doing so, it completed a long cultural journey. The Romans had achieved even warmth through brute force engineering and slavery. The Middle Ages had spiritualized the cold and socialized the hearth. The Renaissance had rediscovered the Roman dream through books. Now, the Enlightenment provided the tools, the measurements, the theories of heat, the rational designs to pursue that dream not as a classical fantasy, but as a scientific project. The stage was now set for the 19th century, with its industrial might, to attempt the mass production of that dream. The question would no longer be, what is the perfect warmth, but how can we sell it to everyone? The 19th century did not just refine the pursuit for warmth, it industrialized it. The Enlightenment had provided the theory, the steam engine provided the power and the scale.
The Victorian era witnessed a cascade of innovations that sought to pipe heat as reliably as water, transforming the home from a fortress against the cold into a serviceable extension of the industrial utility network. This was the era of the mechanical hearth. The first great innovation was steam heating. Patented in the early 1800s, it was first used in factories and greenhouses. By mid-century, it was being installed in the homes of the ultra-wealthy and in public institutions like hospitals and museums. A coal-fired boiler in the basement created steam, which traveled through iron pipes to cast-iron radiators in rooms upstairs. The radiator was a revelation, a dedicated, non-combusting, furniture-like object that emitted a steady, dry, radiant heat. It banished soot and ash from the living space. The fire was now buried in the basement, tended by a servant or a hired stoker, its presence reduced to a hiss and a clank in the pipes. This was the ultimate realization of the Roman ideal, the complete separation of the heat source from the heated space. The Hypocast's hidden furnace had found its modern equivalent. Almost simultaneously, gas lighting arrived, and with it, gas heating. By the 1850s, gas jets were not only illuminating drawing rooms, but also powering gas fires, imitation coal grates with ceramic logs that glowed with real flames. They were instant, controllable, and cleaner than coal. For the middle-class family in a terraced townhouse, a gas fire in the parlor represented modern convenience. It turned warmth into a tap-like utility. You paid a quarterly bill to the gas company, and on-demand heat appeared. The relationship with fuel became entirely abstract. No delivery of coal, no ash to remove, just a meter ticking in the cellar. These systems created a new thermal hierarchy. The wealthy had whole-house steam or hot water systems, with radiators in every room. The middle class had a gas-heated parlor and used coal or oil heaters elsewhere. The poor still relied on a single coal grate if they were lucky, or shivered in unheated rooms. But the idea of universal piped warmth was now planted in the public mind. It was a civilizing force. Social reformers argued that central heating would improve the health and morals of the slum dweller, just as Roman emperors believed baths would civilize the provinces. The Victorian home itself was redesigned around these technologies. High ceilings, good for the convection of warm air from fireplaces, became a disadvantage with radiators. Rooms became smaller, cozier, and more numerous, reflecting the family's fragmentation into private, heatable units: the morning room, the smoking room, the nursery. A vast array of portable heaters emerged for spaces the central system couldn't reach: oil stoves, paraffin heaters, and the dangerous but popular gasogen for heating a single bedroom. The vocabulary of warmth exploded alongside its technology.
Yet, this progress had a dark Dickensian underside. For every townhouse with a gas fire, there were tenements where leaking pipes caused explosions or asphyxiation. The poor, burning cheap coal in cramped quarters, still died of respiratory diseases. And the new systems created new forms of drudgery. The basement boiler room was a hellscape of heat and coal dust, the domain of the lowly odd man or scullery maid. The middle-class housewife now lived in fear of the gas bill, a new and unpredictable domestic expense. The servant problem became, in part, a heating problem, finding and keeping staff willing to haul coal and manage temperamental boilers. The Victorian winter, therefore, was a period of spectacular unevenness. It was the era of the Arctic explorer dying for glory on the ice, and the London socialite complaining of a draft at the opera. It saw the birth of the modern concept of central heating as a selling point for property, and the brutal reality that for most, true warmth remained a luxury. The 19th century had built the pipes and invented the meters. The 20th century's task would be to connect everyone to the grid, and in doing so, complete the slow 2,000-year journey from the Hypocaust to the humming, invisible, utterly mundane comfort we barely think about today.
The final victory over winter was within sight, but its cost in energy, in complexity, and environmental impact was only beginning to be calculated. The 20th century did not invent a new kind of warmth. Instead, it performed a magic trick. It made the extraordinary ordinary, the luxurious mundane. It systematized, miniaturized, and democratized the heating technologies of the Victorian age until they became a background hum in the walls of everyday life. This final transformation turned the ancient struggle against winter into a solved engineering problem, and in doing so, created a world that would have been utterly incomprehensible to a Roman, a medieval lord, or even a Victorian. The key was electrification and mass production. The electric motor allowed for the forced air furnace. Instead of relying on gravity or steam pressure to move heat, a fan could blow air over a heat exchanger and drive it through ducts into every room. This system was cheaper to install in existing homes than steam pipes. After World War II, the booming suburban construction industry in America adopted it as the standard. The thermostat, a simple wall-mounted dial, gave the illusion of complete control. The homeowner could set a number, and the hidden machinery would strive to meet it. The fight was over. Winter was now a temperature setting, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Concurrently, a vast infrastructure of fossil fuel extraction and distribution, oil pipelines, natural gas networks, ensured that this hum never stopped. Fuel oil trucks became a routine sight in suburbs. Natural gas, piped directly into the home, made heating even cleaner and more automatic. The utility company became the distant, impersonal successor to the Roman slave stoking the furnace and the Victorian scullery maid hauling coal. We exchanged direct human labor for a monthly debit from a bank account. This technological victory had profound cultural consequences. It flattened the seasons within the domestic sphere. The specific, intense feeling of coming in from the cold began to fade. With constant, even heat, the body lost its seasonal acclimatization. The rituals of winter, the banking of the fire, the fetching of wood, the huddling in the warmest room, vanished from daily life. They became nostalgic memories or hobbies, not necessities. The architectural need for a hearth as the thermal and social center of the home disappeared. The fireplace persisted, but as a ceremonial relic, a feature often gas-powered, more for ambiance than for warmth. More subtly, this constant warmth redefined comfort itself. It became an expectation, a default condition. To be cold in one's own home shifted from being a normal state of winter to being a sign of poverty, mechanical failure, or personal eccentricity. The old hierarchies of warmth, lord by the hearth, servant in the chilly gallery, were replaced by new ones. The well-insulated suburban home versus the drafty inner-city apartment. The homeowner who could afford to heat the whole house versus the pensioner who heated one room with a space heater.
And then, in the latter part of the century, came the final ironic twist. The conquest of winter led to the invention of summer. The same technology, compression refrigeration, that powered the forced air furnace in winter could be reversed to become air conditioning. The complete year-round climate-controlled environment was born. The ancient human project of weathering the elements reached its logical terminus. The creation of a perpetual artificial spring indoors, regardless of the chaos outside. The Roman had sought this for one season in one room. The modern person achieved it for all seasons in every room. Yet, as we sit in this perfected silence, the old questions whispered by Roman history return as echoes. Our system, like theirs, is predicated on externalized cost and vast complexity. Our fuel is mined or pumped from distant, often unstable places. Our furnaces and power plants are the hidden furnaces of our age. And our comfort, like the senator's in his Hypocaust heated villa, makes us uniquely vulnerable. A grid failure, a price shock, a pipeline rupture, and the hum stops. The modern winter, held at bay for so long, would rush back in with startling speed.
So the 20th century did not end the story. It merely changed its setting. We no longer ask, how will we survive winter? We ask, how will we power our survival? And increasingly, we are forced to ask, what is the cost of this comfort? The ghost in our walls is no longer Roman. It is the ghost of the 20th century promise, the promise of endless, easy, democratic warmth. And like all ghosts, it asks us to remember how it came to be and to wonder, in the quiet hum of our furnaces, what we have built and what we might have lost on the long, warm road from the Hypocaust to the thermostat. The journey for warmth is over. The reckoning with its consequences has just begun. We have charted a 2,000-year quest for a source of heat, from the open fire to the atomic nucleus. But a parallel, quieter, and in many ways more profound story has been unfolding in the spaces between. It is the story not of generating warmth, but of trapping it, not of the flame, but of the void. This is the history of insulation, the science of stillness, and its ultimate triumph represents the most significant break from the ancient logic of heating. For most of human history, the strategy was to produce more heat than the building lost. The modern strategy is to ensure the building loses almost no heat at all. The ancients understood the principle intuitively, if crudely. The Roman used double walls with an air gap in bathhouses. The medieval peasant stuffed wattle and daub with straw and moss. The Viking used thick sod on his roof. These were attempts to create dead air, a layer of motionless gas that is a poor conductor of heat. But these methods were inconsistent, prone to decay, and could not be quantified. A drafty castle might have walls 6 feet thick, but if the stone was porous and the mortar cracked, the cold wind whistled through as if it were paper. The intellectual leap came with the Enlightenment, with scientists like Benjamin Franklin and Count Rumford studying heat as a fluid, caloric, that flowed. They began to quantify conductivity. But it was the 19th century, with the rise of thermodynamics, that gave insulation its scientific gospel. Scientists like James Clerk Maxwell and John Tyndall defined heat transfer precisely: conduction, convection, radiation. They proved that still air was one of the best insulators in existence. The goal of architecture shifted, not to build a massive wall, but to create a perfect, sealed prison for a layer of air. The first modern insulating materials were born of industry. Asbestos, heralded as a miracle mineral for its fire and heat resistance, was woven into mats and wrapped around steam pipes. Cork, boiled and compressed into boards, found use in cold storage. But the true revolution came in the 1930s with fiberglass. Here was a material purpose-built for the task. Millions of glass filaments trapped countless tiny pockets of air. It was lightweight, cheap, and could be rolled into the cavities of wooden frame houses, a construction method that itself was replacing solid masonry. The post-war housing boom married the forced air furnace with the fiberglass battened wall. For the first time, the average home could be a thermally efficient shell. This changed the economics of comfort entirely. It was no longer about who could afford the most fuel, but who could afford the best barrier. Heating bills could be slashed not by enduring chill, but by investing in the building's skin. The storm window replaced the single pane. Vapor barriers sealed walls against moisture. The language of home improvement became a language of physics: R values, U factors, thermal bridging.
The psychological impact was subtle but total. The perfectly insulated home achieved a new kind of silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was still. The sneaky, chilling drafts that had defined the winter experience for all of human history, the cold air moving across a floor, the breeze from a window frame, were eliminated. The sensation of winter became purely visual. You saw frost on the grass through the double-glazed window, but you did not feel it. The environment outside and the environment inside were not just different temperatures, they were different realities, with the wall acting as an impermeable boundary between them. This created a new, ironic vulnerability.
The ancient drafty house was unhealthy and cold, but it breathed. Moisture from cooking, breathing, and washing could escape. The modern, super-insulated house, if not properly ventilated, could become a damp, moldy terrarium, a sealed box of its own atmosphere. We solved the heat loss problem and invented the sick building syndrome. The solution was another machine, the heat recovery ventilator, HRV, which mechanically swaps stale, warm indoor air for fresh, cold outdoor air, reclaiming the heat in the process. The ultimate insulated house requires not just a furnace, but a lung. Thus, the history of insulation is the history of the disappearance of the outside. We have progressed from huddling around a heat source in a porous shelter to filling the shelter's walls with invisible glass wool to keep the heat from ever meeting the outside air. The final step in the Roman project of separation is not a hotter fire, but a better void. The goal is no longer to win a war against the cold air, but to pretend it does not exist at all. The hum in the walls is now matched by a profound, engineered stillness. We live in homes that are, thermally speaking, distant planets, maintaining their own climates in the void of winter. The hearth is gone. The radiator is passé. The true icon of modern warmth is the pale pink blanket of fiberglass hidden behind drywall, doing nothing but being gloriously, passively still. If the 20th century normalized perpetual warmth, the 21st is personalizing it. We have moved from a logic of centralization, the castle's great hall, the Victorian boiler, to one of atomization. The story is no longer about heating spaces, but about microclimating bodies. The hearth has shattered into a constellation of smart devices, each promising a bespoke thermal experience, managed by the silent, omnipresent logic of the algorithm. The first sign was the demise of the thermostat's tyranny. The single wall dial, which assumed one temperature for all, gave way to the programmable thermostat, which could lower the heat while the family was at work or school. This introduced the concept of thermal scheduling. Comfort became a function of time, optimized for efficiency and cost. But the real revolution was zoned heating. With separate thermostats for upstairs and downstairs, or even individual rooms, the idea of a uniform house temperature dissolved. The family fragmented into its thermal preferences. Parents like it at 68 degrees F in the living room, teenagers demand 72 degrees F in their dens, and the guest room stays at 60 degrees F until needed. This fragmentation reached its apotheosis with the smart thermostat. Connected to the internet, learning your habits, adjustable from a phone on the other side of the planet, it turns comfort into a data-driven service. The heating system is no longer a dumb machine responding to a dial. It's an AI that knows you get up at 7:03 a.m., that you leave for the gym on Tuesdays, and that you prefer the bedroom slightly cooler for sleep. It gently nudges behavior, offering Leaf Awards for energy-saving settings. The relationship is no longer human versus machine, but a continuous negotiation between user, algorithm, and utility company, with the goal of maximizing comfort while minimizing the abstract metrics of cost and carbon footprint.
This abstraction has given rise to a new cultural narrative, the ethical BTU. Heating one's home is no longer a simple act of survival or comfort, it is a political and environmental statement. The choice of a geothermal system over an oil boiler is a badge of ecological virtue. The carbon footprint of one's winter comfort becomes a calculable metric, a source of pride or guilt. Governments incentivize this morality play with tax credits for heat pumps and penalties for inefficient furnaces. The medieval hearth tax assessed your ability to pay. The modern carbon tax assesses your cost to the planet. This has sparked a counter-movement, a neo-romanticism of the tangible fuel. The return of the wood-burning stove, particularly the high-efficiency EPA-certified model, is not just about cost savings, it is about re-establishing a visceral connection to the source of warmth. The labor of cutting, splitting, and stacking wood becomes a virtuous, healthy ritual. The smell of wood smoke is fetishized as the scent of real warmth, of self-reliance, and of a circular, carbon-neutral economy, conveniently ignoring particulate pollution. The pellet stove automates this romance, turning compressed sawdust into a commodified, bagged version of pastoral energy. Meanwhile, the cutting edge of energy science pushes further into the invisible. The heat pump is the ultimate expression of modern thermal logic. It doesn't create heat, it moves it, scavenging latent warmth from outdoor air or ground that feels cold to us. It is a machine that defies intuitive physics, warming a house by making the outside slightly colder. Its efficiency is measured in a coefficient, COP, that would mystify a coal merchant. And the promised future of smart grids where your water heater charges up when the wind is blowing and your thermostat adjusts automatically to the real-time price of electricity completes the journey. Warmth becomes a fluid commodity traded on a digital marketplace, its delivery optimized by AIs for grid stability and price. We are left then with a schizophrenic relationship with our own comfort. We crave the hyper-efficient, invisible, algorithmic warmth of the heat pump and the smart grid, and simultaneously yearn for the primal, crackling, labor-intensive warmth of the wood fire. One represents a guilt-free, progressive future, the other represents an authentic, grounded past. The modern winter is spent navigating this divide, trying to balance the ethics of the kilowatt-hour with the psychology of the hearth. The ultimate fuel we are now burning is not coal or gas, but data and ideology. And the warmth it produces is as much about our identity as it is about our body temperature. Our long narrative has focused on the ever-shrinking domain of the cold, the spaces where winter has been banished. But to understand the full paradoxical shape of the modern relationship with winter, we must now look at the places where cold has been deliberately invited back in. For the first time in human history, exposure to the cold is, for a privileged few, not a mark of poverty or failure, but a lifestyle choice, a curated experience of wellness or thrill. The conquered season has returned as a leisure activity. This begins with the wellness cold. The ice bath, the cryotherapy chamber, the winter polar plunge. These are rituals of voluntary exposure that frame the cold as a tonic for the overheated, overstressed modern body and mind. The logic is a complete inversion of the past. Where the Roman sought the caldarium to soothe his muscles, the biohacker seeks the ice bath to reduce inflammation. The cold is no longer an enemy to be defeated, but a disciplinarian to be embraced, a shock to a system grown soft by perpetual comfort. It is thermal austerity as a path to enlightenment, a direct rejection of the 2-millennia-long project we have just chronicled.
In architecture, this manifests as the fashion for unheated spaces in high-end homes, the cold plunge pool in the backyard, the sleeping porch, the Scandinavian-inspired sauna complex where the cycle of extreme heat and a roll in the snow is the goal. These are thermal experiences, deliberately contrasting with the bland, uniform warmth of the insulated main house. They treat temperature like a spice rack. Comfort is the bland base, and one now adds bracing dashes of cold for flavor and effect. More profoundly, the cult of outdoor living has extended brazenly into winter. The patio heater, the fire pit, the heated blanket on the stadium seat. These technologies are not for survival, but for extending the domain of leisure into the conquered territory. We heat the outdoors so we can sit in it. A restaurant's heated terrace in December is a spectacle of triumph, a gilded cage of warmth erected in the face of the vanquished season. It is the ultimate flex. We are so secure in our thermal mastery that we can waste energy for ambiance in the open air. This curated cold reaches its zenith in extreme tourism. The journey to see the northern lights in Arctic Norway, the expedition to Antarctica, these are holidays to the cold. Participants pay a premium to be in environments that humanity spent centuries trying to escape, insulated by high-tech gear, down jackets, electric heated socks that make the experience safe, even cozy. The danger is aesthetic, not existential. The winter landscape is no longer a threat, it is a sublime backdrop for a selfie. This phenomenon reveals a final, ironic truth about our modern condition. Having successfully insulated ourselves from the natural rhythm of the seasons, we now experience ecological nostalgia. We miss the cold, but only on our own terms, as a temporary, controlled sensation. The winter that killed the medieval peasant and preoccupied the Roman engineer is now a source of Instagram content and biohacking bragging rights. Thus, the story of warmth ends not with universal tropical bliss, but with a fragmentation of thermal experience. We have the hyper-efficient, invisible warmth of the smart home. We have the curated, voluntary cold of the wellness retreat. We have the theatrical, outdoor heating of the fire pit. The singular, universal struggle is over. In its place is a menu of thermal options, each signaling something different about our values, our health, and our relationship to a natural world we have, for the most part, successfully walled out. The final chapter of keeping warm is learning how and why to sometimes choose to be cold. We have reached the end of our meandering path. We began with a Roman engineer stacking bricks to create a void for hot air, and we have ended with an algorithm tuning a heat pump to the real-time price of electricity. It has been a journey from tangible labor to abstract calculation, from communal huddle to solipsistic comfort. As this long, quiet monologue draws to a close, we are left not with a simple answer to how did they survive winter, but with a silent equation. A balance sheet of what was gained and what was lost in the great, long war against the cold. On one side of the ledger, the gains are staggering, almost miraculous. Mortality. Winter is no longer a season of mass death from hypothermia and respiratory disease for the urban poor. Comfort. The aching, pervasive chill that was the baseline experience for 99% of humanity, for 99% of history, has been abolished by billions. Productivity. The mind and body can work unimpeded by cold, lengthening the effective day and the productive year. Equality.
Concurrently, the personal heating device has proliferated, rejecting the central system entirely. The electric blanket or heated mattress pad creates a cocoon of warmth for a single body, allowing the rest of the room to stay cold. The ceramic space heater, with its oscillating fan and digital display, can be aimed like a thermal spotlight. The heated office chair, the USB-powered hand warmer, the battery-heated jacket, these are the ultimate expressions of the individualistic thermal quest. Why heat the cathedral when you can wear an electric cloak? This represents a profound philosophical shift. Medieval warmth was communal and hierarchical. Modern central heating was democratic and uniform. Postmodern warmth is solipsistic and on-demand. This has birthed new, almost absurd social rituals. The smart home argument is no longer about the volume of the music, but about the temperature setting someone overrode via their app. The dinner party host must now account for a guest's professed infrared heater allergy or a companion's insistence on bringing their own personal fan. Our thermal profiles become part of our digital identities, another set of preferences in the cloud, alongside our music and movie tastes. Yet this hyper-efficiency and personalization comes with a paradoxical shadow: thermoregulatory de-skilling. For millennia, managing personal warmth was a core survival skill. Knowing how to layer, how to position oneself relative to a fire, how to use a bedstone. Now that skill atrophies. We delegate it to algorithms and expect our clothing to be a fashion statement, not a climatic interface. When the power fails, we are not just cold, we are helplessly cold, lacking the foundational knowledge to create warmth without a machine. So the digital hearth warms us, but it also disperses us. It allows each individual to craft their own perpetual summer,
But in doing so, it eliminates the shared physical experience of seeking warmth together. The family no longer gathers in the warmest room. They retreat to their individually climate-controlled pods. The ancient, unifying struggle against the cold has been solved, and in its place, we have a silent, efficient, and deeply fragmented comfort. The final victory over winter may be the moment we no longer experience it as a collective season, but as a private, digital setting. And in that victory, we may have lost the last great reason to huddle close. Beneath every technological leap in warmth, from the Hypocaust to the smart thermostat, lies a more fundamental story, the story of the fuel. The history of heating is, inescapably, a history of energy conversion. For centuries, this story was tangible and local: the weight of the log, the smell of the peat, the grime of the coal scuttle. In the last 50 years, however, the fuel has become increasingly invisible, abstract, and moralized. We have entered the age of the kilowatt hour and the carbon credit, where warmth is no longer just a physical sensation, but a unit of economic and ethical accounting. The great pivot of the late 19th century was the electrification of heat. The resistance heater, the heat pump, the induction cooktop, they all sever the final physical link between the energy source and the home. The power plant, whether it burns coal, splits atoms, or turns wind, is over the horizon. The electricity arriving at the outlet is anonymous energy. This abstraction has a liberating and a disorienting effect. It makes switching from a gas furnace to an air source heat pump a matter of household engineering, not a change in one's relationship with a fuel delivery man. But it also utterly obscures the true cost. The warmth from a baseboard electric heater powered by a coal-fired grid is far dirtier than that from a high-efficiency natural gas furnace, but to the user, they feel identically clean.
Thermal hierarchy, while not gone, has been dramatically flattened. The difference between a king's warmth and a peasant's is now one of degree and square footage, not a fundamental difference in kind. But the ledger has another column: connection. We have lost the deep, somatic knowledge of the seasons in our bodies. The specific, hard-won pleasure of finding warmth is gone, replaced by an expectation. Community. The hearth as a forced social center, a place you had to gather for light, heat, and cooking, has vanished, taking with it a certain inescapable glue of family and community life. Resilience. Our system is one of profound, centralized fragility. We are all now like the Roman senator in his Hypocaust heated villa, exquisitely comfortable and utterly dependent on a vast, invisible infrastructure that, if it fails, leaves us more helpless than the peasant with his bedstone and his knowledge of the woods. The Roman story haunts this ledger. Their system was the first to show the potential and the peril of the path we've taken. They achieved a magnificent engineered comfort for a few, built on slave labor and resource extraction, and it proved brittle when the empire's logistics frayed. Our system is global, automated, and powered by fossilized sunlight and fission. It is infinitely more robust and democratic, but it is not infinitely robust. It too is built on extraction, on externalities, on a ledger where the true costs, climate change, pollution, geopolitical strife, are often deferred. So, what is the legacy of this long search for warmth? It is not a technology, it is a question. The question the Romans first posed, and we have answered with industrial age finality. To what lengths will we go to separate ourselves from the natural world? We have answered, to any length necessary. We have built a global, intellectual, and physical architecture whose primary purpose is to maintain a narrow, pleasant band of temperature around the human body, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And in the perfect, silent, still warmth of our insulated homes, a final, faint echo of the past remains. It is the memory of the struggle itself.
It is the reason a fake fireplace channel on a television screen is perennially popular. It is the reason we light candles for ambiance. It is the deep, atavistic pull we feel towards a real fire, even if it's inefficient and messy. That pull is the latent heat of history. It is the ghost of the hearth, the last ember of the understanding that warmth was once not a given, but an achievement, a small daily victory wrested from a vast and indifferent cold. The story ends here, in this quiet tension. We live in the triumph of the Roman dream. We have the silent floors, the even temperatures, the endless summer. But in our minds, somewhere deep down, we still remember the value of a single shared fire in a long, dark night. We have conquered winter, but we have not yet decided if, in that perfect conquest, we have warmed our world or merely built ourselves a very comfortable and very lonely planet. Good night.